flagstone was still damp. A constable named Barnes crouched below in the dark of the basement kitchen. The room smelled of ash and lime. Cold air pressed in from the street above. His lantern threw thin gold light across the floor, and there it was. A seam of mortar between two stones, not yet dry. The earth around it, soft. Not the softness of old ground, settled by years of use. Something else. Something recent. Barnes pressed his fingers to the edge of the stone. He felt the give beneath. He looked at his fellow officer without a word. Outside on New Western Street, Bermondsey, the evening of August the 17th moved as evenings do in London. Carts rumbled. Chimney smoke rose in grey threads above the rooftops. A dog barked somewhere near the leather market. People passed the door of number 3 Miniver Place without looking twice. A modest house. 2 stories. A basement. A small garden at the back. Nothing to mark it apart. But the people who had lived there were gone. And somewhere beneath that kitchen floor, Patrick O'Connor had been waiting for someone to find him. The constable lifted the stone. Chapter 1. The Swiss Maid in the City of Smaid. Welcome. Welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now. The world outside has grown still. Whatever hour it is where you are, whatever corner of the earth you have settled into, this is a good time to let the day go. Pull the blanket a little closer. Set the light low. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing left to do. There is only this. A story. A true one. And true stories, as you will find, are always the darkest kind. Before we begin, a small and gentle request. If you have not yet subscribed to the Bedside Historian, this is the moment. It costs you nothing. It takes only a second. And it means that stories like this one, stories pulled from the shadowed corners of real history, will find their way to you again and again. Every subscriber is a lantern in a long corridor. So if this voice is new to you, or if you've been here before and simply forgotten to press that small button, do it now. It helps more than you know. It keeps this channel alive and breathing. And one more thing, before we slip into the past. Where are you listening from tonight? What time does the clock show in your room? Leave it in the comments below. It is a small thing, but there is something wonderful about knowing that a voice from 1849 London is reaching someone in a bedroom in Karachi, or a kitchen in Toronto, or a quiet flat somewhere in Edinburgh at 2:30 in the morning. History travels. That is one of its great gifts. Now, close your eyes if you like. Breathe slowly. We are going back. A tissip. The city of London in the 1840s was not a place that greeted strangers with warmth. It greeted them with noise, with the crash and grind of iron wheels on wet cobblestone, with the shout of a costermonger and the bark of a dray horse and the low, constant moan of 10,000 chimneys pouring their breath into a sky that had long since forgotten what blue looked like. Coal smoke hung over the rooftops like a second roof. The Thames smelled of rot and industry and the particular sourness of a river asked to carry more than any river should. In winter, fog rolled in off the water and swallowed whole streets whole. Gas lamps burned orange inside it. Figures moved like shadows through it. The city hummed and groaned and never quite slept. It was into this city that Maria de Roux arrived sometime in the early years of that decade. She was Swiss. She had been born around 1821 in the canton of Vaud, in a town near Lausanne where the air was clean and the mountains were visible from the road and the smell of the world was grass and pine and cold lake water. She had grown up in a world of modest means, in a household where work was understood to be the price of existence. She had learned to move quietly, to listen before speaking, to watch a room before entering it fully. These were not lessons taught in schoolrooms. They were lessons taught by necessity. She was a handsome woman. Contemporary accounts describe her as striking in appearance. She had a presence that people noticed, a kind of composed confidence that read in certain rooms as elegance. She carried herself in a way that suggested she had not always been poor and might not always remain so. She spoke French as her first tongue, and had picked up English with a quick, precise ear of someone who understood that language was a tool, and that the right tool, used well, could open doors. She came to England as many women of her station came, through service, through the careful, grinding path of domestic employment that defined the lives of thousands of young women in Victorian Britain. A woman without family connections, without capital, without land, had one reliable currency in the mid-19th century: a lever. Her hands. Her ability to move invisibly through the rooms of the wealthy, and to make those rooms run smoothly without ever being thanked for it. Maria de Roux was good at this. She was, by all accounts, very good at this. She found her way into the households of the English upper classes with a speed that suggested both talent and something harder to name. She had manners that could pass in fine company. She knew how silver should be arranged on a table. She knew how a lady should be dressed for the evening. She knew the weight of good fabric and the difference between cloth that was merely expensive and cloth that was genuinely fine. These were the details that mattered in great houses. The details that a lady's maid was paid to know and a housemaid was expected to absorb simply by proximity. Her most distinguished employment brought her into the household of the Duchess of Sutherland. This was not a modest position. The Duchess of Sutherland was one of the most prominent women in England. She was close to the Queen herself. Her house, Stafford House on the Mall, a vast, gilded palace of marble and silk and polished oak, was one of the great social addresses in London. To work there, even below stairs, was to exist within the orbit of real power. To carry a tray through those corridors was to pass paintings worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. To dress the Duchess's daughter for an evening was to handle fabrics imported from the mills of Lyon, ribbons the colour of dawn, shoes made by craftsmen who had never in their lives made anything plain. Maria de Roux moved through all of this with her eyes open. She was not cruel in her ambition. There is no evidence of that. But she was watchful. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has always stood just outside the boundary of comfort, that the world she served was not the world she inhabited. She polished the silver but did not own it. She arranged the flowers, but could not afford them. She fastened the pearls around another woman's throat, and then went back to her own small room and her own small candle and her own small life. This is not an uncommon story. Victorian England was built on the labour of women who were never meant to rise. The machinery of great houses ran on their backs. But Maria de Roux was not built for stillness. She was not built for the permanent below-stairs life. She watched the world above her, and she made calculations. It was during her time in the service of the Duchess of Sutherland that Maria first encountered the man who would, in his way, set everything in motion. His name was Patrick O'Connor. He was Irish. He was older than Maria by a considerable measure. He was not handsome in any classical sense. He was stout and red-faced, and fond of drink in the way that many men of his time and temperament were fond of drink, which is to say thoroughly and without apology. But Patrick O'Connor had something that no amount of appearance could replace. He had money. O'Connor had made himself, over the years, into a man of modest but real wealth. He worked as a gauger for Her Majesty's Customs on the London docks. A gauger measured and assessed the contents of barrels and casks brought into port, wine, spirits, oil, goods from the far corners of empire. It was not glamorous work. It was precise and physical and unglamorous in the way that all practical work is unglamorous. But it paid. And O'Connor had supplemented that income with a second occupation. He was a moneylender. He loaned funds to those who needed them and collected his interest with the calm, patient confidence of a man who understood that debt is one of the few certainties in human life. He had, by 1847, accumulated a sum of railway shares and other investments that made him comfortable. He was not a lord. He was not a banker. But he was a man who could pay his bills without fear, who could take a cab without counting coins, who could invite a woman to dinner without calculating the cost in advance. In the world Maria de Roux inhabited, this counted for a great deal. They met while Maria was in the Duchess's service. The precise circumstances of their first meeting are not recorded in a way that permits certainty. But it is recorded that O'Connor was attracted by what he described as her appearance and her manners. He was the kind of older man who responds to composure in a younger woman as though it was something rare. He was attentive to her. He made his admiration known. For Maria, this attention was not unwelcome. But Maria de Roux was above all things practical. At the same time that O'Connor was making his interest plain, another man entered the picture. His name was Frederick Manning. He was English. He worked as a guard on the Great Western Railway, which meant he spent his days on the new iron roads that were spreading across the country like veins, moving passengers and freight between London and the western counties. Frederick was younger than O'Connor, and better looking in a rougher, plainer way. He had a certain energy. He talked well enough. He presented himself in the particular manner of men who have more charm than substance, as a man on the rise. Frederick Manning told Maria de Roo that he was due to inherit a fortune. His mother, he said, was a woman of means. The money would come to him in time. He spoke of this inheritance with the easy confidence of a man who either believed what he was saying or had said it so often that the distinction no longer troubled him. For Maria, two men stood before her now, and she had to choose. O'Connor, older and settled and demonstrably rich, or Manning, younger and livelier and rich in the future tense. She chose Manning. This is not as surprising as it might seem. Maria de Roo was not simply hunting for a fortune. She was a woman of some pride. She wanted a husband, not a protector. She wanted a home of her own, not a continuation of service under a different roof. Manning offered partnership of a kind. O'Connor offered comfort of a different, more conditional sort. And Manning was persuasive. His charm was real, even if his promises were not. They were married in May of 1847 at St. James's Church in Piccadilly. It was a good address for a wedding. The church stood on a street that smelled of money and cedar wood and coach varnish. The pews were well worn but elegant. Maria wore her best dress. Frederick stood at the altar with the easy posture of a man who has not yet been asked to pay for anything. For a time they lived reasonably well. With two incomes and modest expenses, the Mannings maintained a household that did not embarrass them. They moved through the ordinary rhythms of a working Victorian couple. They ate together. They paid their rent. They received visitors. They were, to all outward appearances, a marriage. But appearances in Victorian England were precisely that. They were performances staged for the benefit of neighbours and creditors, and the general machinery of respectability. Behind the performance things moved differently. The inheritance did not come. Frederick's mother did not die. The fortune that had made him such an attractive prospect remained firmly theoretical. Maria began to understand that she had been misled, not cruelly, not with malice, perhaps, but misled nonetheless. Frederick Manning was a man of small wages and large promises, and the gap between those two things was where the marriage began to hollow out. And through all of it, Patrick O'Connor continued to visit. He had not disappeared from their lives when Maria chose Frederick. He had simply adjusted his position. He came to dinner at the Manning house. He sat at their table. He drank their wine and ate their food and spoke to Frederick with the easy familiarity of a man who has nothing to prove. He was generous. He loaned the Mannings money when they needed it. He was, in the way of men who carry a torch without admitting it, always available and always kind. Maria allowed this. Frederick allowed this. Whether out of practical need or something more complicated or simple indifference, the arrangement persisted. O'Connor visited. He loaned money. He ate and drank and left. He came back. In the late summer of 1847, the Mannings attempted the public house trade. It did not succeed. The venture drained whatever reserves they had managed to accumulate and left them worse off than before. By 1849, they had settled at No. 3 Minerva Place in Bermondsey, a modest terrace of 2-story houses not far from Guy's Hospital and the old leather market. The street was not fashionable. It was not poor in the desperate, grinding sense of the worst London rookeries. But it was plain. It was the address of people who were managing and only just. Maria de Roo had come from Lausanne with her composure and her careful eyes and her hunger for something better. She had worked in one of the finest houses in England. She had held silk and pearl and watched the world of the wealthy from close enough to smell the wax on their floors. And she had ended up in a basement kitchen in Bermondsey with a husband who owed money and an admirer who visited out of habit, and a life that had contracted, slowly, around her, like a room with walls that do not stop moving. She looked at the kitchen floor. She looked at it for a long time. Chapter 2. 2. Men and a Promise. The year 1847 moved through London the way all years moved through London in that decade. Loudly. Hungrily. With the smell of coal and river mud, and the particular exhaustion of a city that never stopped building itself and tearing itself down at the same time. New railways cut through old neighbourhoods. Scaffolding rose over ancient churchyards. The telegraph had arrived, and with it the strange new sensation that the world was shrinking, that news which once took days to travel a mile could now arrive in seconds, humming along a copper wire buried in the earth like a whisper pressed into the ground. Maria de Roo stood at the edge of all this. She was in her mid-20s. She was employed. She was careful. She was watching. Her work and service had given her a particular education that no schoolroom could have offered. She had learned the language of fine houses. She understood the grammar of class as it was spoken in England in the 19th century, which is to say she understood it not as an abstract arrangement, but as a daily, physical reality. The weight of a silver tray. The temperature of water left to stand too long in a copper ewer. The correct angle at which a curtain should fall. The precise distance a servant should maintain from a guest so as to be available without being present. These were the rules of a world she served but did not own, and she had absorbed them completely. She had also learned something harder to define. She had learned to read people. Not in the way that a philosopher reads a text, with slow attention and careful annotation. She read people the way a woman in service has to read them. Quickly. From the corner of the eye. From the tone of a request, and the set of a jaw, and the way a man's hands moved when he spoke about money. This was a skill she had developed without knowing she was developing it. By 1847 it was as natural to her as breathing. Patrick O'Connor, she had read early and read well. He was not a complicated man in the way that complicated men are. He did not have hidden depths so much as a consistent surface. He was Irish-born, somewhere in his 50s, by the time Maria knew him well, and he carried his age in the way that men who have worked physically and drunk regularly tend to carry it. His face was broad and ruddy. His frame was solid, running now toward heaviness. He moved with the deliberate confidence of a man who has long since stopped worrying about what others think of him, which is either the mark of wisdom or the mark of a man who has simply given up caring about the finer edges of life. He worked his post at the customs house on the docks with the quiet competence of a long-serving official. He knew his trade. He knew his instruments. He knew which merchants were honest and which were not, and he applied this knowledge without passion. It was simply his work. It was what he did between meals and between glasses and between visits to places that mattered more to him than the dockside ever did. His money-lending was conducted with equal practicality. He did not advertise himself as a lender in the formal sense. He was not a counting house or a business with a sign above the door. He was simply a man who had accumulated more capital than he needed for daily life, and who was willing to make it available to those who needed it, at a rate of interest that reflected both the risk involved and the reality that people who need money badly enough will agree to almost any terms. He held railway shares. He held foreign bonds. He kept careful records in a notebook that he carried close to his person. He was, in the language of his world, a man of substance. He had been drawn to Maria de Rue from the first time he encountered her in the Sutherland household. He was a man who noticed things, and he noticed her. He noticed the way she moved with that composed, unhurried grace that suggested a woman entirely at ease with herself. He noticed her French accent when she spoke, soft and precise, and slightly foreign in a way that London's drawing rooms found either charming or suspicious, depending on the room. He noticed that she listened to him when he talked, really listened, with a quality of attention that men of his age and temperament find dangerously appealing. He made his interest known in the way men of that era and station made their interest known. He was attentive. He was generous with small gifts and with his time. He sought occasions to be near her. He spoke well of her to anyone who would listen. He was not subtle about any of it. Subtlety had never been a quality O'Connor possessed in great quantity, and by his 50s he had stopped pretending otherwise. Maria received his attentions, and she considered them carefully. She was not indifferent to O'Connor. That would be too simple, and Maria de Rue was never simple. She was aware of his wealth in the way that a woman in her position could not afford not to be aware of it. She was also aware of his age and his habits and the particular brand of comfort he represented, which was the comfort of the already arrived, the comfort of a man who had made his way and settled and had no particular desire to climb any further. And then there was Frederick Manning. Frederick was different in almost every way that a person can be different from another person, while still occupying the same general category of eligible man. He was younger, somewhere in his late 20s, with a lean, alert quality that O'Connor entirely lacked. He had brown hair and a direct gaze, and a way of talking that filled a room without quite dominating it. He was not a gentleman. He made no pretense of being one. He was a working man, a guard on the Great Western Railway, which in the 1840s was still new enough to carry a faint excitement, the railway being one of the great modern miracles of that age. A machine that moved people across the country at speeds that still seemed to some almost supernatural. Frederick had a particular gift. He could make the future sound close. He could describe what was coming with such casual confidence that it began to feel not like a promise, but like a memory. like something that had already happened and simply had not yet arrived. He talked about the inheritance with this quality. His mother, he explained to Maria, was a woman of considerable means. She was in good health, but not young. When she died, which would be in the natural course of things and perhaps not so very long from now, a substantial sum would pass to Frederick. He spoke of this money, the way men speak of money they believe is truly theirs. Not with hunger or anxiety, but with the easy possession of someone who has already counted it in his mind so many times that the counting has become routine. Maria listened to this, and she weighed it against everything else she knew. She was practical, that she was not without feeling. She was calculating, but she was also, beneath the calculation, a woman who wanted something real. She wanted a husband in the full sense of the word. She wanted a home that was hers. She wanted the dignity of a married woman in a century that offered women little dignity of any other kind. O'Connor could give her money, but Frederick could give her partnership. He could give her a shared life, a door with their names above it, a bed that was not a servant's cot in a room at the top of someone else's house. She chose Frederick. She chose him with her eyes open, or as open as anyone's eyes ever are when they are choosing between two imperfect futures. They were married on a day in May of 1847 at St. James's Church in Piccadilly. The church stood on one of the great streets of London, where the shop fronts were polished and the carriages that passed were well sprung, and the air itself seemed slightly better than the air in the rest of the city, or at least slightly less dense with the smell of industry and poverty. The church was old and high-ceilinged and smelled of candle smoke and stone. The pews were worn smooth by generations of fashionable worshippers. Outside, the city moved in its usual roar. Maria stood at the altar in the best dress she owned and said the words that the ceremony required. Frederick stood beside her with his easy posture and his direct gaze and said them too. The register was signed. The thing was done. Maria de Rue became Maria Manning, and whatever she had been before, she was now a wife. What she was not, yet, was rich. The early months of the marriage were not unhappy in any dramatic sense. They were ordinary. The Mannings established a household with the practical competence of two people who are used to managing on limited resources. Maria kept the rooms in order. She had learned from years in service how to make a house function well with minimal expense. She knew how to stretch a meal and mend a curtain and make rooms appear better furnished than they were by the careful placement of the few good things they possessed. These were the quiet arts of the Victorian household, invisible from the outside and exhausting from within. Frederick worked his shifts on the railway and came home with his wages and his stories of the line. He was not a cruel husband. There is no record of violence between them and no suggestion of it in any of the testimony that would later be given at their trial. He was simply insufficient. The inheritance did not come. It did not come in the first months, and it did not come in the first year. And somewhere in the second year of the marriage, Maria began to understand, with the clarity of a woman who has been watching carefully for a long time, that it was not going to come at all. This was not a small thing. This was the central promise on which she had built her choice. She had passed over a man of proven wealth for a man of future wealth, and the future had arrived and brought nothing with it. The railway wages were steady but modest. They were the wages of a man who was comfortable in his station and had no particular urgency about rising above it. Maria had not married for comfort in that sense. She had married for something better, and the gap between what she had been promised and what she had received was a gap that widened with every passing month. Patrick O'Connor continued to visit. This is the detail that requires a moment of attention. When Maria chose Frederick over O'Connor, she had not ended her connection with the older man. She had redirected it. O'Connor had accepted this redirection with the resilience of a man who was accustomed to not getting exactly what he wanted, but who had learned to remain nearby in case circumstances changed. He came to the Manning house for dinner. He sat at their table and ate their food and drank their wine and talked with Frederick in the comfortable way of two men who have tacitly agreed not to discuss the most obvious thing between them. Frederick allowed this. It is difficult now, looking back through the distance of nearly 2 centuries, to understand exactly what Frederick Manning felt about these visits. He did not object to them publicly. He accepted O'Connor's presence in his house and at his table with something that read, to those who observed it, as indifference. Perhaps it was. Perhaps Frederick Manning was a man whose pride did not bend in the directions that other men's pride bent. Or perhaps he was simply a man who understood that O'Connor's money was useful, and that a man who is owed money by another man is not easily turned away from the door. because the Mannings had borrowed from O'Connor. They had borrowed before the marriage, and they borrowed after it. The loans were not enormous by the standard of the wealthy, but for the Mannings they were significant. O'Connor held their debts in his careful notebook along with everything else. He was patient about repayment. He did not press. He was generous in the way that men who hold power over others can afford to be generous, which is to say, his generosity cost him nothing and reminded everyone involved of exactly where things stood. Maria watched all of this with her careful, steady eyes. She watched O'Connor across the dinner table, and she thought about his railway shares and his foreign bonds and his notebook full of careful figures. She thought about the money he had accumulated through years of patient, plodding, unglamorous work. She thought about what that money could mean for a woman who had spent her adult life in other people's houses, handling other people's possessions, making other people's lives run smoothly. She thought about Frederick and his wages, and his absent inheritance, and his easy, insufficient charm. And in the quiet of 1848, as London moved into another year of noise and fog, and the peculiar Victorian mixture of progress and poverty, Maria de Manning began to think about what it would mean to reach across the table and take what she had never been given. The thought came slowly at first, the way dark water rises, gradually, and then all at once. Actib, Chapter 3. A house in Bermondsey in 1849 was a place of work and smell. It sat on the south bank of the Thames, east of London Bridge, and it had been absorbing the industries that the city proper did not want inside its boundaries for centuries. The tanneries had been there the longest. They lined the streets near the old leather market, and they filled the air with the particular assault of their trade, which involved hides and bark and urine and the slow, wet chemistry of turning animal skin into something a gentleman might have made into gloves or a lady might have trimmed to the hem of her coat. The smell did not leave you quickly. It settled into clothes and hair and the wooden beams of nearby houses, and it became, for those who lived close enough to it, simply the smell of where they were. There were also vinegar works and hop warehouses and factories that produced goods whose nature can be guessed from the colour of the smoke they sent into the sky above the neighbourhood. Bermondsey was not a place of elegance. It was a place of industry. It was a place where people worked with their hands and their backs and came home tired and ate what they could afford and slept when the light allowed it. Miniver Place was a small terrace off New Western Street, a modest row of 2-storey houses with basements. Each house had a front parlour and a back room on the ground floor, and the same arrangement repeated above, and below it all. The basement with its kitchen and its stone floor and its smell of coal ash and damp and the particular cold that basement rooms hold, even in summer. The houses were not mean in the absolute sense. They were the houses of people who were managing. There were curtains in the windows and coal in the scuttles, and the front steps were swept, because in Victorian England the swept step was the first line of defence against the appearance of poverty. Number 3, Miniver Place became the Manning household sometime in 1849. They had tried other things before they arrived here. The public house venture had come and gone, consuming money and energy and leaving them in a worse position than before. The public house trade in Victorian London was merciless. It required capital to establish and constant labour to maintain, and the margins were thin even for those who managed it well. The Mannings did not manage it well. Whether through lack of experience or lack of luck, or simply the grinding difficulty of the thing, the venture failed and they moved on. By the time they arrived at Miniver Place, the marriage had taken on a particular texture. It was not a happy marriage in the warm, full sense of the word, but it was a functioning one. Maria and Frederick occupied the same rooms and shared the same table, and kept the same house with the practical coordination of 2 people who have agreed, without saying so aloud, that the arrangement serves them both well enough to continue. Maria took in some dressmaking work. She had the hands for it, and the eye for it. She understood fabric in the way that a woman who has spent years dressing wealthy ladies understands fabric, which is to say she understood it as both a craft and a language. She knew what a good seam looked like. She knew how to shape cloth to a body rather than letting the body disappear inside the cloth. She was good at this work, and it brought in a small additional income, and it gave her something to do with her hands in the hours when Frederick was away on the railway, and the house was quiet, and the rooms felt smaller than they were. Frederick continued his work as a railway guard. The Great Western Railway ran its trains west from Paddington through the green counties beyond London. Frederick's shifts took him away from Bermondsey at odd hours, returning at odd hours, with the irregular rhythm of railway work that meant the house was sometimes full and sometimes empty. in ways that bore no relation to the normal pattern of day and night. When he was home, he ate and drank and talked and occupied the house with his easy, large-limbed presence. When he was away, the room settled back into Maria's keeping and the house became, in a sense, hers alone. She kept it in order. She was meticulous about this. The parlour was arranged with the small, careful touches that show a woman's intent to maintain dignity against circumstance. A cloth on the table. A good lamp. Whatever small ornaments they possessed, placed with attention. The kitchen below was kept clean. The flagstone floor was swept and the range was black-leaded, and the copper pots, of which there were few, were hung in their places. Maria de Roux had been trained in the houses of the great, and she brought that training to bear on her own home with the kind of fierce, quiet pride that is the only luxury available to someone who has nothing else to spend on their surroundings. Patrick O'Connor came to dinner. He came regularly. He had been coming since before the marriage, and he continued to come after it, with a frequency that the neighbours at Miniver Place would later remark upon when questioned by police. He arrived in the afternoon sometimes, or the early evening, a stout red-faced man in a good coat, carrying perhaps a bottle of something or a small parcel wrapped in paper, climbing the front steps with the familiarity of a man who has been to this house many times and expects to be welcomed. Maria received him. She was a good hostess. She set the table carefully and cooked what the household's means allowed, and presented it with more ceremony than the food perhaps required. She understood instinctively the power of a well-set table, how it created a mood of ease and abundance, even when abundance was not strictly present. She poured wine. She listened to O'Connor talk. She asked him questions about his work and his investments and the movements of the railway stocks in which he held his savings, and she asked these questions with an attention that O'Connor found gratifying and did not examine too closely. Frederick was present at some of these dinners and absent from others. On the evenings when Frederick was home, the three of them ate together at the table in the front parlour, a tableau that would have struck most observers as peculiar if they had known its full context, which most observers did not. The relationship between the three of them was one of those domestic arrangements that requires all parties to maintain a certain distance from their own full understanding of it. They ate and talked and passed the bread and poured the wine, and the silence about what else was happening in the room was kept by all three of them simultaneously. But the house was running behind. The debts had not gone away. They had in fact accumulated in the quiet way that debts do when no one is addressing them with sufficient urgency. There were amounts owed to O'Connor from the earlier loans. There were the ordinary debts of daily life, the coal merchant and the butcher and the small tradesman of Bermondsey, whose books held the Manning name in penciled figures. Frederick's wages covered the immediate essentials and little else. The dressmaking brought in something but not enough to change the arithmetic in any meaningful way. Maria looked at the arithmetic and she looked at O'Connor, and she thought. In July of 1849 she made a purchase. A large quantity of quicklime was delivered to the house at Miniver Place. Quicklime was not an unusual material in that era. It had household uses. It was used in the preparation of plaster. It was used in outhouses and cellars to suppress odour and control damp. A housewife buying quicklime was not, in 1849, a remarkable event. No one who saw the delivery thought anything of it. It was a mundane domestic purchase made by a woman keeping a house in order. But Maria de Roux Manning had not bought the lime for plaster. She had not bought it for the outhouse or the cellar. She bought it because she had read in the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had spent years near the kitchens and storerooms of great houses that quicklime would speed the decomposition of organic matter, that it would work on a body in the ground the way it worked on anything else it was applied to, aggressively and without sentiment. She also, around this time, acquired a ripping chisel and a shovel. The kitchen floor at Miniver Place was flagstone, large, grey, flat slabs of stone laid on the compacted earth below. They were heavy enough to require effort to move and solid enough once replaced to show nothing of what lay beneath them. Maria looked at the flagstones, and she made a calculation. The calculation was cold and careful and entirely characteristic of the woman who made it. She began to prepare. On a day in early August, she went down to the kitchen and she moved the furniture, and she lifted the flagstones with the shovel, and she began to dig. The earth beneath was clay-heavy, the particular dense soil of the Thames floodplain that resists the spade and holds the impression of whatever is pressed into it. She dug until the space was deep enough to hold a man. She dug with the quiet, methodical effort of someone performing a necessary task. When the hole was the size she needed it to be, she stopped. She put the stones back. She replaced the furniture. She swept the floor. She wrote to Patrick O'Connor and invited him to dinner. He replied by return, as he always did. He was delighted to accept. He would come on the 9th of August if that suited. He was looking forward to the evening. He remained, as always, her most devoted servant. Maria folded his letter and put it away. She went to the range and began to prepare the meal. Outside, Bermondsey moved in its ordinary way. The tanneries breathed their slow chemical breath into the air. The leather market opened and closed. The cobblestones rang with the hoofs of horses and the iron rims of cartwheels. Children ran in the narrow lanes between houses. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys. The Thames moved south and east and found the sea. In the kitchen of No. 3 Minerva Place, the floor had been prepared. The lime was ready. The grave was waiting. And in 4 days, Patrick O'Connor would walk through the door for the last time. A shipper tip. Chapter 4. The Gwest Wache came to dinner. Patrick O'Connor was not a man given to suspicion. This is perhaps the detail that sits most heavily when the story is considered in full. He was a man of practical intelligence. He had built a modest fortune through patient attention to detail and a clear understanding of how money moved in the world. He was not naive in any professional sense. He had led money to enough people in enough difficult circumstances to know that human beings are capable of almost anything when they are desperate enough, or greedy enough, or both. But he trusted Maria Manning. He had trusted her for years, and in this, Patrick O'Connor made the one calculation of his life that did not account for all the relevant variables. The summer of 1849 had been warm by London standards. The kind of warm that the city bore uneasily, being built for grey and damp, and the particular moderate cold that the Thames Valley offered for most of the year. In summer, the smells intensified. The leather yards of Bermondsey breathed more heavily. The river at low tide revealed its mudbanks, and the mudbanks revealed everything the city had put into the river over the preceding weeks, which was considerable. Flies gathered. Dust rose from the unpaved lanes and settled on everything. The houses held the heat in their bricks, and released it slowly at night in a way that made sleep fitful and rooms close. O'Connor went about his summer in his customary way. He worked his post at the Customs House, and returned to his lodgings at Greenwood Street in Mile End Road in the east of the city. His rooms there were comfortable enough. He was a man who paid attention to his own comfort in the way of men who live alone and have no one else to spend money on. He had good furniture and a good supply of wine, and the careful record-keeping that was the backbone of his financial life. His notebook, in which he tracked his loans and investments with the precision of a man who understands that the only thing standing between him and poverty is accurate arithmetic, was kept close at all times. He received Maria's invitation to dinner on the 9th of August with the pleasure of a man who has few pleasures. He values more than a good meal and agreeable company. He wrote back promptly. He accepted. He looked forward to it. In the days before the dinner, Maria Manning moved through the house at Minerva Place with a focus that Frederick would later describe, in the fractured and self-serving account he gave to police, as perfectly ordinary. She cleaned the kitchen. She aired the parlour. She bought what was needed at the market and prepared it with the care she always brought to the table when O'Connor was expected. She had always cooked well for him. She understood that a good meal placed a guest in a certain state of ease, a warmth and looseness of spirit that made everything that followed feel comfortable and natural. She also checked the kitchen floor. The flagstones were as she had left them. The grave beneath was ready. She had spread quicklime in the bottom, and the lime lay white and sharp-smelling in the dark of the pit, waiting to do its work. She replaced the stones carefully. She swept. She went back upstairs. Frederick Manning was in the house. Whatever conversation passed between him and Maria about what was planned for the evening of the 9th is not recorded and cannot be recovered with certainty. Frederick would later claim in the inconsistent and self-exculpatory statement he made after his arrest that he had not known what Maria intended. This is difficult to credit entirely. The grave had been dug in the kitchen floor of the house they shared. The lime had been purchased and delivered. A shovel and chisel were in the house. These are not things that pass without notice in a small 2-story terrace in Bermondsey. What is certain is that both Mannings were present in the house when O'Connor arrived, and both Mannings were present when he died. The evening of the 9th of August, 1849, began as evenings at Minerva Place had begun before. O'Connor arrived at the door. He was admitted. The house was in order. The table was laid. The lamp was lit against the fading of the summer evening. O'Connor came in from the street and removed his coat and his hat, and settled himself with the ease of a man in a familiar place. He was in good spirits. He talked as he usually talked, about his work and the railway shares and the small news of his daily life. He drank. He was comfortable. Maria had prepared the meal. The exact nature of what she had cooked is not recorded in the surviving accounts, but the meal existed and it was served, and O'Connor ate at least some portion of it, which is known because the surgeon who would later examine his body found evidence of a recently eaten meal. The candles burned. The room was warm. The evening moved in its ordinary rhythm. At some point in the course of the evening, O'Connor prepared to wash his hands. This was a normal act between courses, or at a point of transitioning from one part of the meal to another. He moved toward the arrangements that had been set out for this purpose. He stood with his back partially turned or his attention partially elsewhere. He was in the kitchen or moving toward it in the ordinary manner of a guest in a house where he had dined many times. Maria shot him. The pistol she used was a small one. She had acquired it in advance, as she had acquired the lime and the chisel and the shovel, with the methodical preparation that characterized everything she did. She fired at close range, aiming at his head. The shot was not fatal. The pistol was too small, or the charge insufficient, or the angle not quite right. The ball struck O'Connor in the back of the head, but did not kill him outright. He was wounded, and he fell, and the sound of the shot in the small rooms of that house would have been sharp and final, in a way that erased any remaining question about whether this evening was going to end, as evenings at Miniver Place had ended before. Frederick Manning moved. What Frederick Manning used to finish the killing has been described in different ways by different sources. The most consistent accounts call it a ripping chisel, a heavy tool used in rough carpentry and construction, capable of delivering blunt force with considerable effect. Frederick himself, when he spoke to police after his arrest, offered his own summary of events with a bluntness that was either genuine or calculated to seem so. He said that he had never lied to O'Connor, and that he had battered his head with a ripping chisel. He said this as though it were a simple fact of no particular weight, and perhaps by then, for Frederick Manning it was. O'Connor died on the kitchen floor of number 3 Miniver Place, Bermondsey, on the night of the 9th of August 1849. He was somewhere in his early 50s. He had worked hard for his money. He had been generous with people who had no claim on his generosity. He had trusted with the openness of a man who perhaps should have known better, a woman who had been calculating his death while serving him dinner. The body was heavy. Moving it required effort. The Mannings worked in the kitchen, shifting O'Connor's weight toward the flagstones that Maria had already prepared. The stones were lifted. The hole beneath was exactly large enough because Maria had dug it exactly large enough. The body was lowered in. Mole lime was scattered over it. The flagstones were replaced. The floor was swept. The kitchen looked like a kitchen again. The Mannings sat down and ate their dinner. This detail appears in the trial testimony and in the accounts of those who later reconstructed the events of that night. It is reported without much elaboration in the Victorian press, which treated it as evidence of a particular kind of cold-bloodedness. Whether it was cold-bloodedness in the simple sense, or shock, or some strange need to maintain the appearance of normality after a thing that had shattered normality completely, is something that the historical record does not resolve. What is known is that the meal was finished. The dishes were cleared. The candles burned low, and Patrick O'Connor lay under the flagstones of the kitchen floor, while the house above him settled into the ordinary sounds of a London night. The following morning Maria Manning dressed herself and went out. She went to Greenwood Street in Mile End Road, where O'Connor kept his lodgings. She had a key, or access by some other means, because she entered his rooms without difficulty. She knew what she was looking for, and she knew where to find it. O'Connor had spoken about his finances with the comfortable openness of a man who did not imagine they were at risk. Maria had listened. She now moved through his rooms with purpose, gathering what she had come for. She took railway shares. She took gold. She took cash. She took foreign bonds and whatever else of value she could carry. She moved quickly and without hesitation. She had been planning this part of the evening as carefully as she had planned the dinner. When she had taken what she could, she left. She came back the following day and took more. The 2 visits combined yielded a substantial sum, enough to change the arithmetic of her life in a meaningful way, enough to buy passage and time and the possibility of something new. Back at Miniver Place, the house continued to look like itself. Maria cooked and cleaned and moved through the rooms with her habitual composure. Frederick came and went. The neighbours at the surrounding houses of the terrace observed nothing unusual. The street outside was the same as it always was. The same cobblestones and the same chimney smoke and the same distant percussion of the leather market's daily business. Several days after the murder, 2 men knocked at the door of number 3. They were colleagues of O'Connor from the customs house, men who had noted his absence from work and who knew, as many people in O'Connor's circle knew, that he had been due to dine with the Mannings on the evening of the 9th. They came to inquire. Maria received them at the door. She told them she had not seen O'Connor recently and did not know where he was. The men were polite. They thanked her. They left. But they had unsettled something. Maria, watching from the window as they walked away down New Western Street, decided that they had been detectives. She was wrong. They were simply concerned colleagues doing the ordinary human thing of checking on a missing friend. But Maria's mind had been running in a particular direction for weeks, and it now made the jump with the speed of a mind that knows it is in danger. She went back into the house and told Frederick it was time to go. The 2 of them moved quickly after that. Maria instructed Frederick to sell what furniture he could. He went out to find buyers. While he was gone, Maria acted with the decisiveness that had characterized everything she had done since July. She packed 3 large trunks. She packed the loot from O'Connor's rooms and whatever else of value the house contained. She arranged for a cab to be called. She loaded her trunks and she left. She did not wait for Frederick. Frederick returned to an empty house and a wife who had taken the better part of everything and gone north without him. He took what remained and went west. Behind them, in the quiet kitchen of number 3 Miniver Place, the flagstones held their secret a little longer. The lime was working in the dark. The house waited. The street outside was ordinary, and the damp at the edge of one particular stone had not yet been noticed by anyone. That would come in 8 days. Chapter 5. The Lime and the Showball. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house in which a decision has been made. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of a summer afternoon when the street outside is empty for an hour, and the air hangs still, and the clock on the mantelpiece marks time without urgency. It is a different silence entirely. It is the silence of a room in which something irreversible has been decided, quietly and without announcement, and the walls and the furniture and the light falling through the windows are all ordinary in every visible way, and yet the air has changed. Something is different. Something has crossed a line that cannot be seen but is felt by anyone who steps into the room and pays close enough attention. The house at Miniver Place had this quality in July of 1849. Maria Manning had not made her decision in a single moment. That is not how such decisions are made. They arrive the way a tide arrives. The water moves so slowly at first that the eye cannot detect it. A small advance here, a quiet withdrawal there, and then the tide is simply present, and it is filling the space, and the moment at which it turned has already passed without anyone marking it. Maria's plan had been building in the way of all plans that begin as thoughts and harden slowly into purpose. By July it had hardened completely. She knew what she was going to do. She knew how she was going to do it. What remained was preparation. The quicklime was the first practical step. Lime had been used in England for centuries in ways both constructive and grim. The great cathedrals had been plastered with it. Farmers spread it on their fields to sweeten acid soil. Builders mixed it into mortar that could hold stone walls upright through 100 winters. And in the less documented corners of practical life, lime had long been understood to perform another function entirely. Pressed into the earth around organic matter, quicklime generates heat through a chemical reaction with water in the soil. It is aggressive in its chemistry. It breaks down what is placed near it with a speed and thoroughness that the unassisted earth would not achieve for years. This was knowledge that circulated in the margins of practical Victorian life, the kind of thing known by those who had reason to know it and passed along in ways that left no written record. Maria knew it. How she'd come to know it precisely is something the historical record does not say. Perhaps she had heard it in the servants' halls of the great houses, where practical knowledge of all kinds moved freely between the women who managed kitchens and outhouses, and the less presentable aspects of wealthy households. Perhaps she had simply reasoned it out from what she knew of lime's chemistry and its uses. Either way, she knew what it would do, and she ordered it delivered to the house without hesitation, as though it were flour or coal. The delivery came to Miniver Place without attracting notice. This is worth pausing over. A large quantity of quicklime arriving at a modest house in Bermondsey was not, in the summer of 1849, a thing that required explanation. The neighbours saw a cart. They saw a delivery. They saw nothing unusual. This is how the ordinary world provides cover for the extraordinary. It does not do so through conspiracy or design. It does so simply by being the ordinary world, in which things arrive at houses every day and are taken inside and do not require accounting for. Maria stored the lime in the kitchen. She also had in the house a shovel and a ripping chisel, tools that Frederick may have brought from his railway work or acquired for other purposes. The house at Miniver Place had a small garden at the back, and tools of this kind were not out of place in a household that maintained any kind of outdoor space. They sat in the house and drew no attention. Maria moved around them in her daily work, cooking and cleaning and sewing and setting the table when Frederick came home, and the tools waited. The kitchen floor was flagstone. Maria had lived with that floor for months before she began to think of it differently. It was simply the floor, the surface underfoot in the coldest and most functional room in the house, rough to the touch and grey in the lamplight, and mortared at the seams in the way of floors that had been in place for decades without alteration. She had swept it and scrubbed it and moved around it with the daily unthinking familiarity of a woman who knows her kitchen floor the way she knows her own hands. At some point in early August she began to study it differently. She considered the stones and their placement and the earth beneath. She considered the depth that would be required and the difficulty of the work. She was not a large woman. She was not physically imposing, but she had spent years in hard domestic labour, and her arms were strong, and her back was accustomed to the sustained effort of work that does not announce itself as demanding, but is. She understood that the digging would be difficult, and that it would have to be done without Frederick's help, or at least without his full participation, because if Frederick knew exactly what was under the kitchen floor before the dinner, he would have information that could be used against her later. This calculation may or may not have been conscious, but it is consistent with everything else Maria Manning did in this period, which was to act with the self-possession of a woman who understood that she was the architect of this plan, and that its execution depended entirely on her own precision. She moved the kitchen furniture, the table, the chairs, whatever else occupied the floor space. She did this on a day when Frederick was working the line and the house was hers. She lifted the flagstones with the shovel, working the blade under the edge of each stone and levering it upward. The stones were heavy. They required real effort. The mortar around the edges crumbled in places where it was old, and she set the rubble to one side and worked steadily. The earth beneath was the dense clay of the Thames River basin. It pushed back against the blade. She worked in sections, removing the loosened earth in careful amounts and carrying it in a bucket to the back garden, where she spread it over the ground in a way that would not be immediately obvious. This is laborious and time-consuming and physically demanding in a way that a reading of it in words does not fully convey. She was working in the basement kitchen of a terrace house in August, in the heat that basements trap and hold, with a shovel and a bucket, and the particular grim focus of a woman who has committed herself to a course of action and will not be turned from it. She dug until the hole was deep enough. She did not dig more than was needed. She was precise about this, as she was precise about everything. When the pit was the right size, she stopped. She poured quicklime into the bottom. The lime was white and powdery, and it caught the lamplight and seemed almost to glow at the bottom of the dark pit. She looked at it for a moment. Then she replaced the flagstones above it, pressing them back into position and tamping the mortar seams as well as she could manage. She swept the floor. She replaced the furniture. She washed her hands. The kitchen looked exactly as it had before. This is the moment that requires the most careful consideration. Not the murder itself, which would come later and which would be violent and sudden and horrible in the way that murders are, but this moment. The quiet kitchen, the swept floor, the ordinary lamp, the ordinary walls, and beneath the stone, the prepared earth. The decision made physical, the intention made real. Maria Manning stood in her kitchen and looked at the floor she had laid, and she knew with complete and undeniable clarity what she had done and what it meant and what was going to happen next. She did not falter. The weeks between the digging and the dinner were the weeks of waiting. Maria continued to live in the house in her habitual way. She cooked. She sewed. She received the occasional visitor. She maintained the surface of ordinary domestic life with the same attention she had always brought to surfaces. Frederick came and went on the railway schedule. He ate and drank and occupied the house without suspicion, or at least without any suspicion that he expressed aloud, which in the Manning household amounted to the same thing. Patrick O'Connor visited at least once during this period, and sat at the table in the parlour and ate what Maria had prepared and talked in his comfortable open way about his investments and his work and the small news of his life. Maria listened and asked questions. She filled his glass. She watched him from across the table with those careful, steady eyes. She had already written his name in the earth below the kitchen floor, but she smiled and poured the wine, and the evening passed as evenings at Miniver Place had always passed. It is worth considering what Maria Manning felt during these weeks. The historical record does not offer direct access to her inner life. What survives are the facts of her actions and the testimony of those who observed her from the outside. But the actions themselves speak. She was not erratic. She was not agitated in any way that was noticed by those around her. She continued her work and her housekeeping and her social performance with the consistency of a woman who has resolved a problem and is waiting calmly for the solution to arrive. This consistency is, in its way, more unsettling than panic would have been. Panic is human and comprehensible. It is the natural response to having crossed into territory where there is no return. What Maria Manning displayed was something else. A compartmentalization so complete that the woman who dug the pit and the woman who set the table and poured the wine appear, in all the accounts that survive, to have occupied the same body without any visible conflict. She had been trained by a lifetime of service to maintain the appearance of calm regardless of what she felt. A lady's maid in a great house did not display her feelings. She did not bring her difficulties or her exhaustions into the room she moved through. She moved invisibly, carrying the weight of other people's domestic lives, without allowing that weight to show on her face. This discipline, which had been imposed on her by the structure of her working life, now served a purpose that her employers had never anticipated. The house on Miniver Place held its secret. The lime worked slowly in the earth beneath the kitchen floor, as lime works in the earth, without haste and without remorse. The days of July ended. August began. The London summer pressed its heat into the brick and stone of Bermondsey, and the tanneries breathed, and the river moved, and the ordinary world continued in its ordinary way. On the first day of August, Maria Manning sat down and wrote a letter. She addressed it to Patrick O'Connor at his lodgings in Greenwood Street, Mile End Road. She told him she would be delighted if he would come to dinner on the 9th. She told him she was looking forward to seeing him. She wrote in the warm, easy tone she had always used with him. The letter was signed with the name she had taken when she chose Frederick over O'Connor 2 years before. She sent it out with the morning post. She went back to the kitchen. She swept the floor again, though it did not need sweeping. She checked the seams between the stones with the heel of her shoe, pressing gently, feeling forgive. Everything was solid. Everything was in order. She went upstairs and waited for his reply. Diff. Chapter 6. The 9th of August. The morning of August the 9th came in grey and close, as London mornings in that summer came. The sky above Bermondsey was the colour of old pewter, flat and without depth, the kind of sky that promises neither rain nor sun, but simply presses down on the rooftops with a uniform, indifferent weight. Chimney smoke hung low. The tanneries had begun their day early, as they always did, and the smell of the yards drifted east on the slow air. Cartwheels rang on the cobblestones of New Weston Street. A pieman made his way along the pavement with his tray balanced on one arm, calling his wares in the flat, habitual voice of a man who has made this call 10,000 times and expects to make it 10,000 more. At number 3 Miniver Place, Maria Manning had been awake since before the grey light found the curtains. She had slept, because she was a woman who could. Whatever moved in the depths of her mind on the night before the 9th of August, it did not keep her from rest. She rose at the hour she customarily rose, and she dressed at the washstand in the corner of the bedroom, pouring cold water from the ceramic ewer into the basin, its surface slightly chipped at the rim from years of use. She washed her face and her hands and dried them on the linen cloth hanging from the hook on the wall. She pinned her hair with the careful, practiced movements of a woman who has dressed herself without assistance for years. She went downstairs. The kitchen was as she had left it. The flagstones were smooth and swept. The range was cold and needed to be lit. She crouched before it and arranged the coals and the kindling and lit it from a match struck on the iron surround, holding the small flame to the paper until it caught and spread. The range ticked and breathed as it warmed. The kettle was filled from the ewer, kept on the kitchen shelf, and set to heat. The day began. Maria had planned the menu with the same precision she had brought to every other aspect of the evening. She knew what O'Connor enjoyed. She had cooked for him many times, and she knew his tastes the way a good cook knows the tastes of a regular guest. She had purchased what was needed at the market the previous day. The ingredients were stored in the cool of the pantry shelf, a small ventilated cupboard built into the north wall of the kitchen, where things kept longest in the summer heat. She took out what she needed and set it on the preparation table and began. She cooked through the morning. The kitchen filled slowly with the smell of food and coal smoke, and the particular warmth of a range working at full output on a day that is already warm enough without it. She moved between the range and the table with the efficiency of a woman who has never had the luxury of wasted movement. Every motion had a purpose. Every pot was where it needed to be. She did not drop things. She did not burn things. She cooked, and she always cooked, with the steady, unhurried attention of someone to whom the preparation of a meal is a serious undertaking and not merely a domestic obligation. Frederick Manning was in the house. Exactly where he passed the hours of that morning is not recorded with precision. He was present, which is to say he occupied the rooms above the kitchen. Whether he knew, on that particular morning, the full extent of what the evening would bring, is a question that the subsequent trial examined at length and did not resolve cleanly. Frederick would say one thing to police and another to his lawyers, and his account would shift and contract under examination, like a material that cannot hold a fixed shape. What can be said is that he was there. He ate breakfast. He moved through the house. He did not stop what was happening. Outside on the streets of Bermondsey, the day moved toward evening in its usual way. The light changed as London light changes in August, not fading so much as thickening. The grey of the morning becoming the deeper, more golden grey of a summer afternoon. The shadows lengthening in the lanes between houses. The market traders began to pack up their remaining stock. The tanneries slowed. The streets took on the quieter, easier character of the early evening, when the day's hardest work is done and the night's entertainments have not yet begun. In Mile End Road, Patrick O'Connor was preparing for his evening. He was in good spirits. This is recorded in fragments of testimony given later by those who saw him that day. He had been looking forward to dinner at the Mannings. He was a sociable man, and the Manning household was one of the addresses he visited with genuine pleasure. He dressed for the occasion in the way a man of his type dressed for a dinner out, which is to say adequately and without great fuss. He had good clothing, and he wore it well enough. He took his hat and his coat from the stand by his lodgings door. He had his notebook with him, as he always did. He had his purse. He called a cab. The journey from Mile End Road to Bermondsey was not long by London standards. The cab moved south and west through the streets, crossing the river by one of the bridges, moving through the neighbourhood that was already taking on the character of early evening, the gas lamps being lit in the wider streets, their orange light beginning to assert itself against the failing daylight. O'Connor rode with the ease of a man on his way to a pleasant evening. He watched the streets of London pass outside the cab window with the incurious familiarity of a long-term inhabitant who has stopped seeing the city because he has seen it too many times. He arrived at Miniver Place. He paid the cab driver. He climbed the front steps of number 3 and knocked the door. Maria opened it. She was composed. She was dressed neatly, in the dark, well-maintained dress she wore for company. Her hair was properly arranged. She greeted O'Connor with the warmth she had always shown him, the particular warmth of a woman who knows how to make a guest feel expected and welcome and valued. She took his coat and his hat. She showed him through to the parlour. The parlour was set. The table was laid with the care Maria always brought to it when O'Connor came. The cloth was white. The lamp was lit. There were glasses on the table and a bottle already opened on the sideboard, a decent wine that Maria had purchased for the occasion, knowing what O'Connor liked and providing it without being asked. The room was warm, and the smell of the cooking moved through the house in a way that was genuinely good. Whatever else Maria Manning was, she could cook, and the smell of her kitchen was the smell of a real meal prepared with real skill. O'Connor sat down. He talked. He drank. Frederick was present in that first part of the evening, moving through the rooms with the slightly forced easiness of a man who was making an effort to appear at ease. The two men talked in the way they always talked, about the railway and the docks and the state of the roads, and whatever else occupied the conversational space between men who know each other well enough not to have to perform interest, but not well enough to say anything true. Maria moved between the kitchen and the parlour. She brought food. She filled glasses. She was attentive without being hovering. She was a perfect hostess. O'Connor ate. He was comfortable. The meal was good, and the wine was sufficient, and the room was warm, and there was nothing in any visible detail of the evening that suggested anything other than a pleasant dinner in the home of people he had known for years. At some point in the evening, O'Connor rose to wash his hands. This was the ordinary movement of a man in a house where he knew the geography, moving toward the kitchen, or toward the arrangements that had been set out for washing. Turning away from the table and the candles and the easy warmth of the parlour, he turned his back, or partially turned it, as people do when they're moving from one place to another without urgency or attention. Maria raised the pistol. The shot was close, and the sound of it in the confined space of that house was enormous. It was the sound that divided everything that had come before it from everything that would come after. O'Connor staggered. The ball had struck the back of his skull. It had wounded him severely, but had not killed him. He was down but alive, his great solid body refusing the simple finality that Maria had intended. Frederick came with the chisel. He swung it against O'Connor's head with a force that the surgeon who would later examine the body would describe as considerable. He struck more than once. O'Connor was a heavy man, and a man of physical substance, and dying was not something he did easily or quickly. But the chisel in the blows was sufficient, and what the pistol had begun, Frederick finished, and the kitchen floor of number 3 Miniver Place became the scene of something that no amount of domestic order could now conceal or undo. The silence after was total. O'Connor lay on the flagstones. Blood had moved across the grey stone with the patient inevitability of fluid on a flat surface. The lamp still burned. The wine still stood on the sideboard. The smell of the cooking still moved through the house, absurd and indifferent in the way that smells continue after the reason for them has ended. The Mannings worked in silence. They had to move the body, and the body was heavy, and the work required real physical effort. They dragged and shifted him across the floor toward the flagstones that Maria had prepared. She lifted the stones, and they lowered O'Connor into the earth beneath. He lay in the pit among the white lime that Maria had scattered there weeks ago in anticipation of exactly this. More lime was added. The flagstones were replaced. The seams were pressed back into position. Maria swept the kitchen floor. She swept it with the same broom she used every day. The strokes were even and careful. She moved the broom from one side to the other in the way she had moved it 1,000 times before, and the floor emerged from under the broom, looking as it always looked, flagstone and mortar and the ordinary grime of a kitchen that is used every day. The Mannings went back to the parlour. They sat. The meal was still on the table, the dishes partly cleared, the wine still open. They finished eating. What they said to one another in that hour, or whether they said anything at all, is not recorded. The only sound that comes down through the years from that evening is the scrape of the broom, and then silence. The lamp burned. The candles burned. The house on Miniver Place was entirely still. Patrick O'Connor lay under the kitchen floor, and the lime began its work in the dark. Extirpa. Chapter 7. The morning after Maria Manning slept. Whether she slept soundly is something that cannot be known. But she slept, because the following morning she was up at her customary hour and dressed at her customary time and out of the house before the city had fully organised itself for the day. She slept the way a woman sleeps, who has made a decision and carried it out, and is now in the phase of management that follows, where clear thinking and steady movement matter more than anything else. The morning of August the 10th was cooler than the night had been. The grey press of the previous day had given way to something slightly more open, the sky showing thin white light through a high haze, the streets of Bermondsey damp from a light rain that had fallen sometime in the night. The cobblestones were dark and wet. A thin mist still hung over the lower parts of the street near the river. The morning traffic had begun, carts and horses and the first workers moving toward their various occupations, the city assembling itself from its overnight dispersal, with the mechanical consistency of a thing that does not know how to do otherwise. Maria walked to a cab stand. She was dressed plainly and well, in the way she always dressed when going out on business of any kind. She did not look like a woman in distress. She did not look like a woman in a hurry. She looked like what she appeared to be, which was a respectable housewife from a modest Bermondsey terrace, going about the errands of her morning. The cab driver who took her fare and noted her destination would later come forward to give evidence to police, and his account is remarkable for what it does not contain. There was nothing in her manner that he found remarkable. She was simply a passenger. She sat in the cab and was driven east toward Mile End Road, and she was unremarkable in every visible way. Patrick O'Connor's lodgings were in Greenwood Street, a quiet residential road off Mile End Road in the east of the city. The neighbourhood was respectable in the solid, unshowy way of streets occupied by men of modest professional means. O'Connor had lived there comfortably and kept his rooms in the careful order of a man who lived alone and valued his own comfort. His landlord or landlady attended to the house's general maintenance. His rooms were his own domain. Maria had access. The exact nature of that access is recorded in ways that are slightly inconsistent across the surviving accounts. She may have had a key. O'Connor may have given her one at some earlier point in their long and complicated acquaintance, with the trusting generosity of a man who had never imagined the use to which it might eventually be put. Or she may have entered by other means, perhaps claiming to the household staff or landlady that she had come on O'Connor's instruction to collect some item on his behalf. She was a woman of composure and confidence, and she had spent her adult life moving through spaces she did not own, with the invisible authority of someone who belongs. She entered his rooms. What she found there was the accumulated material evidence of Patrick O'Connor's long, patient accumulation of wealth. He had kept his financial papers in order. His railway shares were bundled and documented. His foreign bonds were similarly kept. His cash was present in amounts that reflected the habits of a careful man who did not use banks in the way that later generations would come to use them, keeping real money in real rooms where it could be touched and counted and confirmed. He had gold. He had watches, the good ones that a man of his position would own as a matter of self-respect rather than display. He had chains and rings, and the other small physical forms that wealth takes when it is held by a man who does not live extravagantly but does not stint himself either. Maria moved to the rooms with purpose. She took the railway shares. She took the foreign bonds. She took the cash, which was substantial enough to matter considerably in the arithmetic of her situation. She took the gold and the watches. She worked quickly and systematically, moving from one place to another in the room with the efficiency of a woman who had made a mental inventory in advance and was simply executing it. She did not disturb things unnecessarily. She did not leave the room in a state that would announce itself immediately as ransacked. She was careful, as she was always careful, about the appearance of things. When she had taken what she could carry, she left. She went back to the street and walked with her parcelled goods and her composed expression through the morning crowd of Mile End Road. She did not run. She did not look over her shoulder. She made her way to a cab and was driven back toward Bermondsey and the house on Miniver Place, where Frederick was waiting and where, in the kitchen below, the lime was already at its work. She came back the following day. This second visit is one of the details that speaks most clearly to the quality of Maria Manning's nerve. She had shot a man and helped bury him under her kitchen floor and spent the subsequent morning robbing his rooms. And the next morning she went back. She returned to Greenwood Street and entered O'Connor's rooms again and took more of what remained. She was thorough. She intended to leave nothing of value that might later go to someone else. Nothing that might be recovered by creditors or officials or any of the various parties who would eventually come to sort through a dead man's effects. Whatever O'Connor had accumulated over the years of his careful, unglamorous working life, Maria Manning intended to have it. Back at Miniver Place, the stolen goods were now beginning to accumulate in the house. Shares and bonds and cash and gold and watches, the portable wealth of the man who had been under the kitchen floor for less than 2 days. Maria began to organize it. She was already thinking about what came next, which is to say she was already thinking about leaving. The plan had always included this part. The murder was not the end of the plan. It was the middle of it. The end was departure. A new city. A new name. The transformation of the stolen goods into actual freedom. But the plan was already beginning to fray. 3 days after the murder, 2 men knocked at the door of number 3 Miniver Place. They were customs colleagues of O'Connor, men who worked with him at the docks, and who had noted his absence from his post with the concerned attention of colleagues who knew his habits well. They knew he had been due to dine with the Mannings on the evening of the 9th. They came to inquire. It was a natural thing to do. It was simply the ordinary human act of following the last known thread of a missing friend. Maria received them at the door with her customary composure. She told them she had not seen O'Connor for some days. She did not know where he was. She expressed the mild, polite concern of a woman to whom the news of his disappearance was a slight surprise and nothing more. The men thanked her. They left. But they had rattled something. Maria watched them go from the window and made the assessment that would drive everything that followed. She decided they had been police. She was wrong in the specific, but not entirely wrong in the general sense. The net was not yet tightening because the body had not yet been found. But it would tighten, and she knew it would tighten. And the gap between the moment it began to close and the moment she was clear of London was the only thing that mattered now. She went inside and told Frederick it was time to go. She told him to sell what furniture he could and to bring the proceeds. Frederick went out to find buyers for the chairs and the table, and the small portable pieces that could be converted to cash quickly enough to be useful. While he was gone, Maria packed. She had 3 large trunks. They were the trunks of a woman who had been in service, which is to say they were good trunks, well made, capable of holding a substantial amount of material. She packed with the systematic efficiency that characterized everything she did. She put in the stolen goods, the shares and bonds and gold. She put in her clothes, the good ones, the ones worth keeping. She put in whatever else of value the house contained that she could carry. She packed as though she were packing for a journey of indefinite length, which is exactly what she was doing. She sent word for a cab. When it arrived, she loaded the trunks with the driver's help and climbed in. The cab drove north through Bermondsey and then west, and then further north through the city. The cab driver noted the route because he would later describe it to police with precision. He took her to London Bridge Station first, where she deposited 2 of the trunks in the station's luggage office. Then he took her on to Euston Station. At Euston, she bought a ticket. The destination was Edinburgh. The cab driver watched her go through the station doors with her remaining trunk and her composed expression and her ticket to the north. He drove away. He did not think of her again until the police came to ask him questions, at which point he thought of little else. Frederick Manning returned to Miniver Place to an empty house. He stood in the rooms that were now missing their furniture and their curtains and their occupant, and he understood what had happened. Maria had taken the better part of the stolen goods and the better part of everything else and gone without him. She had not left a note. She had not sent word by any means. She had simply packed her 3 trunks and gone north and left him with the empty house and the kitchen floor and whatever remained of the stolen goods that she had not judged worth taking. He took what was left. He left the house. He went west, toward the coast, and eventually crossed to the island of Jersey, where he took rooms in St. Helier and began to spend what he had, with the furtive, accelerating urgency of a man who knows he is carrying something that burns. At Miniver Place, number 3 stood quiet. The parlour was stripped. The range was cold. The front step had not been swept. The curtains were gone from the windows. The house looked to any observer like a house that had been recently and suddenly vacated, which is exactly what it was. In the kitchen, the flagstones were still. The lime worked below them in the darkness. The mortar at the edge of one particular stone had been replaced carelessly in the work of that August night, pressed back with less precision than Maria had brought the rest of her preparations. In the cool damp of the basement kitchen, it had not set as firmly as the old mortar around it. A small seam remained where the 2 surfaces did not quite meet. Moisture moved in the earth below and rose through that seam in the way that moisture rises through the smallest opening in stone. The corner of the flagstone was not dry. It would be 7 more days before anyone noticed. 7 days in which London moved in its ordinary noise, and the tanneries breathed, and the river turned, and the city carried on with the vast, indifferent business of being itself. 7 days of ordinary August in Bermondsey, with its carts and its smoke and its steady percussion of working life. And then a constable named Barnes walked down the stairs into the basement kitchen and held his lantern low. Chapter 8. The Flight. The railways had changed the nature of escape. Before the iron roads came, a fugitive in England was limited by the speed of a horse and the condition of the turnpike. A man or woman running from London could cover perhaps 30 miles in a day by coach, 40 if the roads were good and the horses were fresh and the weather did not intervene. The country was large enough and the roads were uncertain enough that disappearing into it was a genuine possibility, and many people had done exactly that over the centuries, simply walking away from one life and into another with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that the world beyond the next county had no particular memory of them. By 1849 all of this had changed. The Great Western Railway could carry a passenger from London to Bristol in 2 hours. The London and North Western could reach Birmingham before a man on horseback had cleared the northern suburbs. The Edinburgh line could put a passenger in Scotland by nightfall if they boarded at Euston in the morning. The railways had compressed the country in ways that were still being absorbed, and one of the things they had changed completely was the geography of flight. A person running from London could now be 200 miles away before the morning was properly over. Maria Manning understood this. She had lived in a railway household. Frederick had worked the mine for years, and the rhythms of the railway were as familiar to her as the rhythms of her own kitchen. She knew the stations and the routes and the times. She knew that a woman with money for a ticket and trunks to load could be in Edinburgh before anyone in Bermondsey had thought to ask where she had gone. She boarded at Euston on the morning in mid-August, the precise date being within a day or two of the 12th, with her remaining trunk and her ticket and the proceeds of everything she had taken from O'Connor's rooms and from the house at Miniver Place. The station at Euston was one of the great theatrical spaces of Victorian London. It had been built in the early years of the railway age with a grandeur that was partly practical and partly a statement about what the railways meant. The vast arched roof above the platforms, the columns and the stonework, the perpetual roar of engines and the smell of steam and coal, and the particular electric energy of a place where large numbers of people are in constant motion towards somewhere else. Maria moved through it without drawing attention to herself. This was a skill she had. She loaded her trunk into the luggage van and took her seat in the carriage, and the train pulled out of Euston Station, and London fell away behind her. The city thinned at the edges, the dense brick and smoke giving way to the outer suburbs, then to market gardens and fields, then to the open English countryside rolling out in every direction under the August sky. Maria sat in her seat and watched it pass and said nothing to anyone. The train moved north through the Midlands, through the flat centre of England where the horizon was wide and the sky was large. It passed through stations that were not London and would never be London. It carried its passengers through the cooling afternoon toward the border. Maria sat in her seat, and the engine pulled and the miles accumulated behind her in Edinburgh came closer, with every revolution of the iron wheels. She arrived in Edinburgh and took lodgings. The city received her without particular interest. Edinburgh in 1849 was a city accustomed to receiving strangers. It had its old town and its new town, its medieval lanes and its Georgian terraces, its sharp cold air and its particular quality of grey northern light. It was a city of merchants and lawyers and students and the various professionals who had made their lives in its stony precincts over the generations. A well-dressed woman arriving with a trunk and money to pay for lodgings was not a remarkable thing. She settled herself in her rooms and began to think about the next step. The railway shares and foreign bonds she had taken from O'Connor's lodgings needed to be converted into cash. They were valuable, but they were not liquid in the way that coin was liquid. They were paper instruments backed by the credit of railway companies and foreign governments, and they needed to pass through the hands of someone authorized to deal in them before they became the kind of money that could be used to buy a passage abroad or establish a new life somewhere outside the reach of London's constables. She needed a stockbroker. This is the point at which Maria Manning's remarkable composure and her remarkable plan both reached their limits simultaneously. She was a woman of great practical intelligence, and she had planned and executed an enormously complex crime with a precision that most criminals never approach, but she was operating at the edge of her knowledge. She understood domestic management, and she understood the value of money, and she understood how to move through the world with authority and confidence. What she did not fully understand was the small, specific world of stock and bond dealing, which had its own rules and its own networks and its own ways of knowing things that an outsider would not anticipate. She went to a firm of Edinburgh stockbrokers and presented O'Connor's railway shares for conversion. The brokers looked at the shares. They looked at the woman presenting them. Edinburgh, despite being 300 miles from London, was not outside the information networks of Victorian commercial life. The telegraph had reached Scotland. Brokers communicated with brokers across the country with a speed that the old postal roads had never permitted. These particular brokers had received word through exactly those networks that railway shares had been stolen in connection with a disappearance in London. They were watching. They were suspicious of Maria's French accent and her slightly too confident manner and the specific shares she was presenting, which matched in their description the shares that had been reported missing. They did not arrest her themselves. They could not. They were stockbrokers, not officers. But they sent word to the Edinburgh police, and they kept Maria occupied long enough for the constables to arrive. She was taken into custody. The Edinburgh police had in fact already been alerted by telegraph from London's Scotland Yard before Maria walked into the stockbroker's office. Superintendent Hames of Scotland Yard had traced her journey through the cab driver who had taken her to London Bridge and then to Euston. He had found the trunks she had deposited in the luggage office at London Bridge Station, and opened them and discovered the evidence of what she had packed and where she was going. He had telegraphed Edinburgh. By the time the stockbrokers sent their message, the Edinburgh police were already looking for a French accented woman with stolen railway shares. Maria was brought to the police station. She was questioned. Her trunks were searched and their contents inventoried. The stolen goods were catalogued. The railway shares were identified. The gold and the watches and the bonds were all present. Maria sat through this process with a composure that the Edinburgh officers who dealt with her would later describe with a kind of unwilling admiration. She was not hysterical. She was not pleading. She was contained, in the way of a woman who has accepted that a particular phase of her plan has ended and is already, beneath the surface, calculating what comes next. She was returned to London under escort. The journey south on the same railway she had taken north would have been a particular kind of torment. The miles reversed, the country running backward past the window. London reassembling itself out of the fields and suburbs as the train moved south. But Maria gave no outward sign of what she felt. She sat in her seat and she watched the country pass, and she kept her own counsel. She arrived back in London and was taken to Horsemonger Lane Gaol in Walworth, the prison that would, in 3 months' time, become the last place she ever saw. Exepic, Frederick Manning's flight was less considered and less competent than Maria's in almost every way. He had been left in the empty house at Miniver Place with the stripped rooms and the kitchen floor and a reduced share of the stolen goods. Maria had taken the bulk of it. What remained was enough to travel on and to fund a few weeks of living. But it was not the freedom that either of them had planned for. Frederick was a man who responded to stress the way some men do, with motion and noise and the temporary comfort of spending money he did not entirely have. He went west. He made his way to the coast and took a passage across the water to the island of Jersey, which was British but separate, a small island in the English Channel whose distance from the mainland made it, in the minds of certain fugitives, a kind of intermediate freedom. Frederick arrived in St. Helier, the island's main town, and took rooms and began to spend. He drank. This is the detail that his behaviour in Jersey is most consistently remembered for. He drank brandy in quantities that drew attention, which is a thing that drinking brandy in quantities will reliably do in any small town where strangers are noticed. He spent money without the caution of a man who is trying to make a limited supply last. He was loose with himself in the way of a man who has run and does not quite know what to do, now that the running is over and the destination has been reached, and it is not very different from anywhere else. He drew attention. The people of St. Helier noticed him. A man spending freely and drinking deeply and volunteering no clear account of himself was not invisible in a small island community. Word moved, as word moves in such places, through the informal networks of observation and conversation that constitute the intelligence of any close community. And the police of Jersey were in contact with the police of London, because by this point the investigation into O'Connor's disappearance was fully underway, and Scotland Yard was casting its net across every route a fugitive from Bermondsey might reasonably have taken. Detective Edward Langley was deployed from London to Jersey. He travelled by the same modern network of railways and steamships that had made the whole pursuit possible, crossing the Channel with his warrant and his instructions and his Scotland Yard authority, and arriving in St. Helier with the quiet, purposeful manner of a professional man attending to a professional manner of a man, attending to a professional matter. He found Frederick without great difficulty. Frederick was arrested in Jersey and brought back to London. Unlike Maria, he was not contained when taken. He was agitated and shifting in his manner, the easy looseness of the railway guard replaced by something more desperate. He had been drinking for days in St. Helier, and the alcohol had stripped away whatever remained of his composure. When he spoke to police, he spoke in the disjointed, self-contradicting way of a man trying to construct a story and realizing mid-construction that it will not hold. He said that Maria had shot O'Connor. He said that he himself had then struck O'Connor with a ripping chisel. He said he had never liked O'Connor. He offered this last detail with a frankness that seemed almost to surprise himself, as though he had not quite intended to be so direct about it. The statement he gave was inconsistent in its particulars, and consistent only in its attempt to place the greater share of blame on Maria. Maria, for her part, was in Horsemonger Lane Gaol constructing an account of her own that reversed the allocation almost entirely. Both Mannings were now in custody. Both were charged with the murder of Patrick O'Connor. They were held separately in the prison, which was also the prison in which they would be executed 3 months later, though that fact was not yet settled on the day of their arrival. The house at Miniver Place had already given up its secret. The investigation had moved faster than either Manning had anticipated. The body had been found. The evidence had been gathered. The Scotland Yard officers had done their work with a thoroughness that the case demanded, and that the particular circumstances of the Bermondsey horror had made urgent, because this was not a quiet, private matter. This was already a newspaper story. This was already the kind of case that sold broadsides on street corners and filled the pages of the illustrated papers, and was discussed in the coffee houses and the taverns and the drawing rooms of Victorian London with the breathless intensity that murder cases attracted in an age when public execution was still an entertainment. The two Mannings arrived at Horsemonger Lane Gaol in separate states. Maria composed and watchful, Frederick unravelled and frightened and already trying to separate himself from what he had done by the only mechanism available to him, which was to insist it was mostly her. The trial was 3 months away. The gallows were 3 months and 3 days away. But the autumn was arriving and the days were shortening, and the city outside the prison walls moved in its great indifferent roar, and neither Frederick nor Maria Manning would see anything outside those walls again, except the sky above the roof on the morning of the 13th November. Ickchip. Chapter 9. The stone is lifted. The 17th of August was a Wednesday. The morning came in ordinary. The streets of Bermondsey began their business at the hour they always began it, with the first carts and the first workers and the first smoke rising from the first fires lit in the first kitchens of the morning. The leather market opened. The tannery yards breathed their slow chemistry into the already heavy air. Children appeared on the pavements with bare feet and quick eyes. A dog crossed New Western Street at a trot and disappeared into the lane beside the old wall. At number 3 Miniver Place, the curtains were gone from the windows. The front step had not been swept in days. The house had the specific emptiness of a dwelling recently vacated in haste, a quality that is distinct from the emptiness of a house whose occupants are simply away. A house vacated in haste looks abandoned rather than empty. It has a stilled quality, like a mechanism that has stopped mid-motion. The hat stand in the hallway with nothing on it. The rings on the parlour wall where pictures had hung. The pale marks on the floorboards where furniture legs had stood for months, and the wood around them had darkened. The neighbours had noticed. In Miniver Place, as in all such terraces of modest Victorian housing, the texture of neighbouring lives was known in the way that proximity always creates knowledge, not intimacy, not friendship necessarily, but the accumulated data of daily observation. The Mannings had been noticed arriving and had been noticed in their habits and were now noticed to be gone. James Coleman, the landlord who lived at number 1, was aware that something was not right about the house next door. He had heard things. He had seen the departure. He had questions about the rent. The police came to Miniver Place because of O'Connor's colleagues. The customs men who had knocked at the door days earlier and received Maria's composed denial had not stopped thinking about O'Connor's absence. They had made inquiries at his lodgings in Greenwood Street and had found his rooms disturbed, his papers disarranged, his railway shares and bonds conspicuously absent. They had gone back to their superiors at the customs house, and their superiors had gone to the police. The police had gone to Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard had begun to make the kind of systematic inquiry that was, by 1849, the established method of a detective force that was still relatively new but had already developed the habits of organised investigation. The connection to the Mannings was not difficult to make. O'Connor had dined with them on the 9th. He had not been seen since the 9th. The Mannings had departed from Miniver Place with evident urgency sometime in the days immediately following. The house was empty. The landlord had not received notice. These facts arranged themselves for the officers examining them into a shape that had only one plausible interpretation. Constables Barnes and Burton were sent to Miniver Place on the 17th of August. Their instruction was to search the premises and to note anything of significance. They arrived at the house in the morning. The door was not locked. All was opened by Coleman, and the two officers entered and moved through the rooms with the systematic attention of men trained to observe. The ground floor yielded nothing of immediate significance. The stripped rooms had the emptiness already described. The walls were bare. The furniture was mostly gone. The fireplace in the parlour held cold ash. The officers moved from room to room, and noted what they saw and found nothing that answered the central question of where Patrick O'Connor was. They descended the stairs to the basement. The basement of number 3 Miniver Place was the kitchen. It was the lowest and coldest room in the house, reached by a narrow stair from the back of the ground floor. The walls were stone and plaster, patched in places where the damp had worked through. The The range stood against one wall, cold and black-leaded, its grate empty of everything. The kitchen shelf held a few items left behind in the departure. The things not worth taking: a cracked bowl, an old cloth, a pot without a handle. The window that looked out at the level of the street let in thin grey light from the area outside. The floor was flagstone. Constable Barnes held his lantern low and moved it slowly across the floor. The light ran over the grey stones and into the joints between them, and somewhere in that movement of lamplight across cold stone, something caught his attention. He moved the lamp back. He held it steady. One flagstone near the back of the kitchen showed a seam of mortar that was different from the mortar around it. The old mortar in the rest of the floor had the dark, settled colour of material that has been in place for years, stained by moisture and age into a grey that was nearly indistinguishable from the stones themselves. The mortar at the edge of this particular stone was lighter. It did not have the time to absorb the colour of its surroundings, and at one corner of the stone, where the replacement mortar had been pressed in less carefully than elsewhere, there was a slight dampness. Not the general dampness of a basement room, which was everywhere and unremarkable, but a specific dampness localized to this particular seam. Barnes pressed his fingers to the edge of the stone. He felt the earth give very slightly beneath. He looked at Burton. They sent for a senior officer. Inspector Haynes arrived at Miniver Place and descended to the basement kitchen and examined what Barnes had found. He brought with him the tools necessary for lifting stone. He also brought with him the particular quality of attention that a senior detective brings to a scene he has already half understood before he walks into it. He had been building a picture of the Manning household for days. He had the missing man, the missing couple, the disturbed lodgings, the absent shares. He had come to Miniver Place already expecting to find something. He had not known precisely what. But looking at the flagstone with the light mortar and the damp corner, he had a very clear sense that he was standing above it. The flagstone was lifted. It required effort. The stone was heavy, and the prying required 2 men and the right angle of leverage. But it came up, and the one beside it was lifted as well, and what was beneath was the disturbed earth that Barnes had felt in the give of the stone, loose and dark and smelling of lime, and the other thing that lime had been working to suppress but had not suppressed entirely. They dug. The surgeon Samuel Meggitt Lockwood arrived at the house as the excavation was being completed. He came down the stairs into the kitchen as the constables were completing the grim work of removing the earth. He entered the kitchen as the body was being drawn out of its shallow grave in the floor of the house where it had been placed 8 days before. His initial examination, conducted in the lamplight of that basement kitchen with the cold stone floor under his feet and the smell of lime and mortality around him, determined the cause of death as a combination of blunt force trauma to the skull and a gunshot wound to the head. He also removed from the mouth of the deceased a set of false teeth. This detail is one of those small human facts that history preserves almost by accident, a detail too specific and too strange to be invented. Patrick O'Connor wore false teeth. They had remained with the body through 8 days in the lime-treated earth and through the examination that followed, and they were lifted out of his mouth by the surgeon's careful hands, and they became, in the subsequent proceedings, one of the key means by which the body was formally identified as O'Connor, because the false teeth were known to those who knew him and could be confirmed. The body was removed from the kitchen. The grave in the floor of Miniver Place was empty now, the quicklime exposed at the bottom, white and caustic, having done its work as far as it could manage in 8 days, which was considerably but not completely. What the lime had not yet finished, the police examination and the surgeon's report would now document in full. The news moved fast. By the afternoon of the 17th of August, the story was in motion. A body found under the kitchen floor of a Bermondsey house. A husband and wife fled. A murdered man identified as a customs officer and moneylender of some means. The details were exactly the kind of details that the Victorian newspaper reading public found irresistible. They were specific and domestic and horrible, and they contained within them the elements of a story that could be told and retold. The house on Miniver Place, already empty and strict, became a point of interest for the neighbourhood immediately. People came to look at the front of the house from the street. They pointed at the windows with their empty rings where the curtains had been. They talked in low voices about what had been found below. Scotland Yard sent word to Edinburgh by telegraph. The message arrived with the speed that the Victorian telegraph achieved, faster than any horse, faster than any mail coach, the electrical signal carrying its information along the copper wire buried in the earth at a pace that still astonished people who had grown up in the age of horseback. The Edinburgh police already had Maria in custody for the stockbroker matter. The message from London connected that custody to the body in Bermondsey with a completeness that removed all remaining uncertainty. The message to Jersey followed. At Miniver Place, the house was sealed. Officers remained to secure the scene. The kitchen floor with its open grave was examined and documented with the care that a case of this significance demanded. The evidence was catalogued. The lime, the depth of the pit, the placement of the body, the mortar work that had given everything away. All of it was noted and preserved for the proceedings that would follow. Outside on New Western Street, the ordinary life of Bermondsey continued around the sealed house with only the slight increase in foot traffic and the small clusters of curious observers to mark the difference. The carts passed. The tanneries breathed. A thin rain began in the late afternoon and darkened the cobblestones and ran in the gutters and fell on the roof of number 3 Miniver Place without distinction, treating it exactly as it treated every other roof on the street. Inside, the empty kitchen held the smell of lime and stone and the particular cold of a room that had been a grave. The flagstones were lifted and stacked to one side. The hole in the earth gaped in the lamplight. The range was cold. The shelf was bare. The window let in the grey afternoon light and the sound of rain. Patrick O'Connor had been found. He had been under the floor of that kitchen for 8 days, and the lime had worked on him, and he had been moved and laid out and examined, and would now be given, in due time, the burial that had been denied him since the evening of the 9th of August. He had come to dinner at Miniver Place for the last time, and had been received with warmth and fed a good meal and killed under the kitchen light and covered with lime and stone by the hands of people he had trusted. Constable Barnes marked the flagstone in his notebook. He noted the damp seam and the soft earth and the precise location within the kitchen. He noted the time and the date. He noted the name of the surgeon and the condition of the body on its removal. He wrote in the careful, practical hand of a man who understands that the details in a notebook may one day be read aloud in a courtroom and had better therefore be exactly right. He was correct about that. They would be. Chapter 10. The Chasse and the Capture. The machinery of Victorian law enforcement was not yet the apparatus it would become. Scotland Yard had been established only 20 years before the Bermondsey murder, born out of the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 and the particular vision of Robert Peel, who had argued against the scepticism of those who believed that a professional police force was incompatible with English liberty. The detective branch, the plain-clothes officers who investigated rather than simply patrolled, was newer still. It had come into formal existence in 1842, only 7 years before Maria Manning shot Patrick O'Connor in her kitchen. By 1849, the detective branch was small. It consisted of a handful of inspectors and sergeants, operating out of Scotland Yard with a jurisdiction that covered the metropolis, and an informal reach that extended, through cooperation and communication, considerably further. What it lacked in numbers it was learning to compensate for in method. The use of the telegraph, the systematic questioning of witnesses, the careful documentation of evidence, the construction of a chain of events from physical detail. These were the habits of a detective branch that was in the process of defining itself, and the Manning case gave it one of its earliest significant tests. Superintendent Haynes led the investigation. He was a methodical man operating in an era that was beginning to understand, for the first time, what methodical investigation looked like when applied to serious crime. He had the body. He had the house. He had the testimony of neighbours and the cab driver and Coleman, the landlord and the customs colleagues of O'Connor. He had the evidence from Greenwood Street, the disturbed rooms and the absent shares. He had, within days of finding the body, a clear picture of who had done this and approximately where they had gone. The telegraph was the instrument that made the speed of the subsequent captures possible. The telegraph in England in 1849 was not yet universal, but it was extensive. The railway companies had been among its earliest and most enthusiastic adopters, stringing their wires along their lines and using them to coordinate the movement of trains with an efficiency that the old signal flag system could not approach. The police had understood quickly that a technology capable of sending a message from London to Edinburgh in the time it took to write the message was a technology that transformed the geography of pursuit. A fugitive who could outrun a horse could not outrun the telegraph. Maria Manning had taken the train to Edinburgh, believing that distance would protect her. The telegraph had arrived before her. The Edinburgh police had received Haynes's message and had already been watching for a woman matching Maria's description when the stockbrokers sent their own alert. The arrest when it came was therefore less a dramatic capture than a convergence of two streams of information arriving at the same point. Maria was already under suspicion when she walked into the counting house with O'Connor's railway shares. The brokers delayed her with the professional smoothness of men experienced in the management of uncomfortable situations. The police arrived. The business was concluded. She was brought to the police station, and her trunks were searched and their contents spread out on a table for examination and inventory. The railway shares were there, identified by their particular registry numbers against the listing that O'Connor's careful records had made possible. The bonds were there. The gold was there. The watches were there. The sum total of what Maria had taken from Greenwood Street was laid out on a table in Edinburgh and counted and documented by officers who had never been to Bermondsey and had never met Patrick O'Connor, but who understood what they were looking at. Maria sat and watched this process. What she felt during it, her account of her own inner life, is not preserved in any form that history can access with certainty. What is preserved is the testimony of the officers who dealt with her, and their testimony is consistent in one particular. She was controlled. She was not weeping. She was not raving. She sat and watched them inventory her trunks with the self-possession of a woman who has accepted that this particular maneuver has failed and is already thinking about the next. She was escorted south by train. The same journey she had made north in the flush of the planned success, she now made in reverse, under escort, watching England reassemble itself outside the window as the train moved from Edinburgh toward London. The cities and fields and market towns reversed themselves past the glass. The country grew smaller and more industrial as the south approached. And then London was there. The density of it, the smoke, the rooftops multiplying in every direction from the line, and the train pulled into the station and Maria Manning was in London again. She was taken to Horsemonger Lane Gaol. The prison stood in Walworth, south of the river, a solid, purposeful Victorian institution of brick and iron and the particular smell of confinement that brick and iron accumulate over years of housing people against their will. Maria was received by the prison governor and assigned her cell, and the process of formal incarceration began. The removal of personal items, the issuance of the prison's own clothing, the various procedures by which a free person is transformed, bureaucratically, into a prisoner. 3 female warders were assigned to her cell to sleep there through the nights. This was not standard procedure for all prisoners. It was a measure taken specifically because of Maria's character and the assessment of those managing her custody that she was a woman capable of taking independent action if left unwatched. This assessment was correct. Despite the warders, Maria attempted twice during her imprisonment to harm herself, once by attempting strangulation and once by attempting to puncture her own throat with her fingernails. Both attempts were stopped. She was kept alive and she was kept under close observation and she was preserved, with the grim institutional thoroughness of the Victorian prison system, for the gallows. Frederick Manning's capture in Jersey was less dramatically managed, but equally complete. Detective Edward Langley crossed to Jersey with his warrant and his instructions, and the particular professional calm of a man who has been sent to bring someone back and intends to do exactly that. Jersey was small enough and St. Helier small enough within it, that a stranger who had been spending freely and drinking heavily for the better part of a week was not difficult to locate. The island's own police had already become aware of Frederick. The alert from London had confirmed what local observation had already suggested. Langley found Frederick in St. Helier. The precise circumstances of the arrest are not recorded in great detail in the surviving accounts, but the general character of it is clear. Frederick was not in a condition to offer significant resistance, physical or otherwise. The brandy and the days of anxious spending had reduced him to something considerably less than the easy, confident railway guard who had sat at the table of Miniver Place and talked about his future inheritance. He was a frightened man who had been running in the only direction available to him, and had reached the edge of the island and stopped and waited, in the way of men who cannot think of the next move. For something to happen. Something happened. He was brought back to London and lodged at Horsemonger Lane Gaol alongside his wife, though not in proximity to her. The prison held them in separate parts of its cold brick interior, which suited the legal strategy that both their counsels were already beginning to develop, which was to present each Manning as primarily a victim of the other's scheming. Maria's counsel would argue that Frederick was the prime mover. Frederick's counsel would argue that Maria was. Both arguments were correct in their assessment of the other defendant, and both were therefore mutually destructive in the way of defences built on accusation rather than exculpation. The couple communicated during their imprisonment through letters that the prison authorities committed and examined. The tone of these letters shifted over the weeks between arrest and trial. There was initially a coldness between them that reflected the double cross in Bermondsey, the stripped house and the packed trunks, and the departure that had left Frederick with the empty rooms and the kitchen floor. Maria had taken the greater share and left without a word. Frederick had not forgotten this. But as the trial approached and the reality of their shared situation became undeniable, the letters became warmer. Not reconciled exactly. Not the warmth of a repaired marriage, but the warmth of two people who recognize that they are facing the same end and that the hostility between them has ceased to matter in any practical sense. The city outside Horsemonger Lane Gow moved in its autumn rhythms. September gave way to October. The leaves came off the plane trees in Walworth and lay in wet drifts in the gutters. The nights came earlier. The gas lamps came on sooner. The newspapers continued to carry the Manning case with the enthusiasm of a press that understood it had a story of rare public appetite, containing as it did every element that the Victorian reading public found most compelling: domestic treachery, sexual intrigue, a foreign woman, a weak husband, greed, violence, burial under the kitchen floor. The Bermondsey Horror, as the papers had named it in the first days after the discovery, was a story that had everything. In Horsemonger Lane Gow, Maria Manning sat with her 3 warders and thought her thoughts and kept her counsel. She was preparing for the trial. She was preparing for it with the same focused attention she had brought to the preparation of the grave and the dinner and the flight north. She was a woman who, even now, even in a prison cell with warders sleeping across the room from her, was thinking carefully about what came next and how to manage it. She would manage it, in the event, with considerable drama and very little success. But that was still in October. There was time yet. The trial was coming. The Old Bailey was waiting. And the autumn of 1849 was moving through London with its usual grey efficiency, shortening the days and cooling the air and bringing everything with the patient inevitability of the season toward the dark. Chapter 11. The Old Bailey. The court of the Old Bailey stood on the edge of the city of London, on a street that had held courts and prisons for centuries. The street itself was named for the ancient wall that had once defined the boundary of the medieval city, the outer bailey of a fortification that London had long since outgrown and built over and largely forgotten. What remained was the name and the institution, the Criminal Court of England, which had been hearing cases on that street since the 16th century, in various forms and iterations, each one more formal and more elaborate than the last, processing the great dark inventory of human crime with the grinding regularity of a mill that never stops turning and never empties. By October of 1849, the Old Bailey was one of the most familiar buildings in London. Every person who had read a newspaper in the preceding half-century knew its name and knew something of what happened inside it. Trials of significance were reported in the papers with a detail and enthusiasm that made them, for the reading public, a form of theatre. The courtroom was public. Observers could attend. The proceedings were conducted with the formal ceremony of English law, the wigs and gowns and the particular archaic language that the common law had preserved across the centuries, a language that sounded to the uninitiated like the past speaking directly into the present. The trial of Frederick Manning and Maria Manning opened on the 25th of October 1849. The case was presided over by Chief Justice Cresswell, a senior judge of the common law courts, whose manner on the bench was described by those who appeared before him as measured and precise, and entirely without sentiment. He was a man who had spent his professional life in the careful application of legal principle to human mess, and he brought to the Manning trial the same quality of controlled attention that he brought to everything. He was not interested in the drama. He was interested in the evidence. The courtroom was full. It had been full since before the doors opened, because this was the Bermondsey Horror, and the Bermondsey Horror was the story of the autumn, and anyone who could claim a seat inside the Old Bailey on the 25th of October had been trying to claim one since the trial date was announced. The gallery held as many observers as it could accommodate without structural difficulty. The press benches were occupied by the reporters of every major London paper. The public benches were taken by the kind of people who attend famous trials, which is to say a mixture of the genuinely curious, the professionally interested, the morbidly fascinated, and the merely determined. Maria and Frederick Manning were brought into the dock. They entered separately and stood side by side in the dock with the particular proximity of two people who have been married and committed a murder together, and then betrayed each other, and then depraved each other and spent 2 months in the same prison in separate cells. and now stand together again under circumstances that leave no ambiguity about how the story ends. They stood close, but not touching. They did not look at each other with warmth. The charges were read. Both were charged with the willful murder of Patrick O'Connor at Minerva Place, Bermondsey, on the 9th of August in the year of our Lord 1849. Both were asked to enter their pleas. Both pleaded not guilty. This was expected. Not guilty was the only plea available to a defendant who wished to contest the evidence and force the prosecution to prove its case. The pleading of not guilty in the face of what both Mannings knew to be the facts was not dishonesty in the legal sense. It was the mechanism by which a trial was initiated. It set the machinery of the court in motion and began the formal process of establishing, through evidence and testimony, what a jury of 12 men should be asked to conclude. The prosecution opened its case with the systematic clarity that the evidence permitted. The case was, in structural terms, not complicated. O'Connor had been invited to dinner at the Manning house. He had not been seen alive after that dinner. 8 days later, his body had been found under the kitchen floor. He had been shot and bludgeoned to death. Both Mannings had fled the house immediately after the murder. Both had been found in possession of goods stolen from O'Connor's lodgings. Both had given accounts of events that were inconsistent and self-serving, and that pointed, each in their own way, at the other. The witnesses were called. James Coleman, the landlord, described what he had observed of the Manning household in the weeks preceding and following the murder. He spoke about the delivery of lime to the house. He spoke about the sudden departure. He described the state in which he found the house after the Mannings had gone. The cab driver who had taken Maria to London Bridge and then to Euston gave his account. He described her manner, her trunks, her route, her destination. He was precise about the dates and the times. He was the kind of witness that prosecutors value greatly, a man with a specific trade memory who remembered fares and routes the way that his work required him to remember them. Constable Barnes described the kitchen at Minerva Place. He described the flagstone with its lighter mortar and its damp corner. He described the sensation of the earth giving slightly beneath his fingers when he pressed the stone. He described the lifting of the stone and what was found beneath it. He described this in the careful, factual language of a police officer giving evidence, without embellishment, without drama, and the absence of embellishment made it more effective than any ornamentation could have. Surgeon Lockwood described the body. He described the injuries to the skull, the gunshot wound and the bludgeoning, and he gave his professional opinion as to the cause of death and the sequence of events, as the physical evidence suggested them. He described the removal of the false teeth. He confirmed the identification of the body as Patrick O'Connor. He gave his testimony in the precise technical language of Victorian medical practice, and the jury listened with the attention of men who understood that what the surgeon was describing was the last minutes of a man's life. The counsel for each defendant did what the situation required and what the strategy of mutual accusation demanded. Maria's counsel argued that Frederick had been the prime mover. He was the physical man. He had struck the killing blows. His own statement to police had admitted the use of the chisel. He had admitted striking O'Connor. He had admitted this with a casualness that suggested not remorse, but rather a kind of rough pride in the act. And this was not the confession of a man who had been forced into something against his nature, but the admission of a man who had done what he wanted to do. Frederick's counsel argued the reverse with equal conviction. Maria had purchased the lime. Maria had dug the grave. Maria had invited O'Connor and prepared the dinner and placed him in the position in which he was shot. The pistol had been acquired by Maria. The entire elaborate preparation of the crime, the months of planning, the careful digging, the quick lime, the letter of invitation, all of this was Maria's work. Frederick had been drawn into something whose full nature he had not understood until it was too late to stop it. Both arguments were substantially true. Both arguments were also substantially insufficient. The jury had heard the evidence, and the evidence did not leave room for the kind of interpretive space that either defense required. Two people had dug a grave and killed a man, and buried him under the kitchen floor and fled with his property. The question of who had been more responsible was interesting, but it was not the legal question the jury had been assembled to answer. The legal question was whether each of the defendants before the court had participated in the willful murder of Patrick O'Connor. The evidence answered that question without ambiguity. The trial lasted 2 days. This was not unusual for the period. Victorian criminal trials moved at a pace that would seem extraordinary to later centuries. The rules of evidence were applied with vigour, but not the elaboration that would develop in subsequent decades. Witnesses were examined and cross-examined with efficiency. Arguments were made with the directness that the adversarial system encourages when both sides have access to the same set of facts and both know it. On the second day, Chief Justice Cresswell summed up. His summary was thorough and impartial in the way of a judge who has heard the evidence and has formed his own view of it, but understands that forming his own view and directing the jury to share it are different things. He took the jury through the prosecution's evidence with care. He took them through the defense arguments with equal care. He explained the legal principles that applied. He was measured and he was clear, and he was entirely without the theatrical quality that some judges brought to their summings up, preferring precision to effect. The jury retired at a few minutes before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They were back inside 45 minutes. The foreman stood and delivered the verdicts in the quiet, flat, carrying voice of a man who has been chosen for a responsibility and intends to discharge it properly. Guilty. Guilty. The word landed in the courtroom the same way both times, dropping into the silence of the watching gallery and the press benches, and the dock itself, with the weight of something that cannot be recalled. Chief Justice Cresswell put on the black cap. Maria Manning did not receive her sentence in silence. She received it in the way of a woman who had been contained and controlled through the whole long process of her arrest and imprisonment and trial, and who had now reached the point at which containment was no longer something she was willing to perform. She raised her voice in the courtroom of the Old Bailey, and she directed it of the jury, and she told them what she thought of them and of the English justice that had produced this verdict. She called the English a perfidious race. She said the word perfidious with the full force of a woman who has been waiting for the moment to say exactly that word and is now saying it in the grandest possible setting. She was not quiet, and she was not composed, and she was not the controlled, watchful woman who had set the table at Miniver Place with such careful attention. She was something older and rawer than that. She was a woman who had nothing left to lose and was spending what remained of her composure on the only expenditure still available to her. She was taken from the dock, still speaking. Her voice carried through the courtroom and out into the corridor beyond, and faded only when the distance had finally swallowed it. Frederick received his sentence in silence. He stood in the dock with the diminished, collapsed quality he had shown since his arrest in Jersey, and he heard the words, and he said nothing. The easiness and the charm and the railway guard's confident bearing were entirely gone. What stood in the dock was simply a man at the end of his story, listening to it being told. Both Mannings were returned to Horsemonger Lane Gaol. The execution was set for the morning of Tuesday the 13th of November. 3 weeks remained between the sentence and the gallows, which was the customary interval that Victorian justice maintained between condemnation and death, long enough for the condemned to make their peace with whatever they believed in, and short enough to prevent the situation from becoming administratively complicated. The newspapers reported the verdict with the enthusiasm of the press that had been following every detail since August, and had no intention of reducing its attention now that the climax was approaching. The broadsides were already being printed, the cheap single sheets that street literature sellers would hawk in their hundreds of thousands in the days before and after the execution, carrying the details of the crime and the trial, and whatever account of the condemned's final days could be assembled or embellished in time. The Manning broadsides would, in the event, sell in numbers that no broadside had sold before, a fact that said something specific about the particular appetite of Victorian England for this particular story. In Horsemonger Lane Gaol, the 3 warders continued to sleep in Maria's cell. Frederick occupied his own part of the prison in his own diminished silence. The autumn of 1849 moved through its final weeks with the grey efficiency of the season. The days shortened. The cold arrived. The frost came to the window glass at night. November came. The gallows were built on the flat roof above the main gate of the prison, as was customary. They went up in the days before the execution, the timber and the iron hardware assembled by the prison's own workmen, with the practical competence of people for whom this was a known task and not a novel one. The structure rose above the roofline of the prison, and could be seen from the street below and from the windows of the houses across the road, and those who saw it from a distance understood what it meant and marked the date on whatever calendar they kept. William Calcraft had been engaged as the executioner. He was not new to this work. He had been conducting executions for the City of London and the County of Middlesex since 1829, the same year that Scotland Yard had been established, and he was, by 1849, the most experienced hangman in England. He had put 20 women to death before Maria Manning. He knew his trade. He was not a man who invited biographical attention, and the historical record preserves him in outline rather than in detail. A practical figure at the edge of events, whose role was entirely defined by its function. Maria Manning would be the 21st woman William Calcraft hanged. He came to Horsemonger Lane on the evening before the execution to inspect the gallows and make his preparations. The rope was checked. The drop was measured. The mechanism of the bolt that would release the platform was tested. Everything was in order. The morning of the 13th of November was coming. London was already preparing to watch. Chapter 12. The Roof of Hull, the Roof Horsemonger Lane. The night before the execution was long. In the condemned cells of Horsemonger Lane gaol, the hours moved with a particular slowness of time that has been given a fixed endpoint. Maria Manning lay in her cell with the 3 warders breathing in the dark around her, and the cold of the November night pressing through the stone walls and the small barred window. She had attempted twice to end her own life and had been prevented both times by the bodies sleeping in the same room, the institutional care of a system that wanted her alive for its own purposes. She lay in the dark, and whatever passed through her mind in those final hours is a country to which history has no road. Frederick was in his own part of the prison. He had been quieter in his final weeks than Maria in hers. The collapse of the man who had made easy promises about inheritances that never came. The railway guard whose charm had run out some distance before the rope. He had received the prison chaplain and had spoken with him in the way of a man who is not certain what he believes, but who has nothing left to protect, and therefore no particular reason to maintain the performance of certainty. He was frightened. He was a frightened man who had reached the end of a road he had walked with his wife, and who was now going to walk the last few steps of it in her presence, though not with her warmth. The night passed. Dawn came to London on the 13th of November, in the way that November dawn comes, slowly and without warmth, the darkness thinning from black to grey to the particular flat cold light of an English autumn morning that offers no comfort and makes no promises about the day ahead. Outside Horsemonger Lane gaol, the crowd had been gathering since before midnight. This requires a moment of consideration. People had come from across London and from beyond it, arriving in the night, in the dark and the cold, to claim a position on the street outside the prison from which they would be able to see the roof above the main gate. They had come on foot and by cab and by the railways that Frederick Manning had spent his working life guarding. They had paid for rooms in the houses whose upper windows overlook the execution site, those rooms having been let at prices that reflected the scarcity of good viewing positions and the depth of public appetite for this particular spectacle. By dawn, the crowd numbered in the tens of thousands. The most careful estimates placed it between 30,000 and 50,000 people, pressed into the streets around Horsemonger Lane, with the density that only the largest public gatherings achieve. Every standing space was taken. Every rooftop with a view was occupied. Every window in the houses across the road held faces. The noise of the crowd was the noise of a very large number of human beings in the same confined space, a constant layered sound of voices and movement, and the particular electricity that gathers in crowds that have assembled to witness something final. 500 police officers had been deployed to manage the crowd. They stood at intervals and in lines and attempted with the limited tools available to them, which were their bodies and their batons and their instructions, to maintain some order in a space that had already exceeded any reasonable capacity for order. They were not entirely successful. The crowd pressed and shifted and the police lines bent under it, and the street around Horsemonger Lane was a mass of humanity that the institution of public execution had summoned and could not now control. Charles Dickens was in the crowd. He had taken a room overlooking the execution site, paying for it in advance and arriving the previous evening to secure his position. He was 37 years old and he was already the most famous novelist in England. He had published Dombey and Son. He had published The Cricket on the Hearth. He had published The Pickwick Papers, and Oliver Twist, and Nicholas Nickleby, and A Christmas Carol. He was a man who had spent his professional life in the examination of London, its streets and its institutions and its people, and he came to Horsemonger Lane on the morning of the 13th of November, not with the appetite of the crowd, but with the particular grim intention of a man who wants to see a thing clearly in order to write about it honestly. He watched the crowd more than he watched the gallows. What he saw below him in the street was what horrified him. The crowd was not solemn. It was not quiet. It was not gathered in the spirit of reflection or deterrence, which were the official justifications for public execution. It was boisterous and loud and cruel in the thoughtless way of very large numbers of people who have assembled for entertainment and are treating what they are watching as entertainment. There were people smoking clay pipes and drinking from bottles. There were pickpockets working the edges of the crowd with the professional efficiency of people who understand that a crowd focused on something else is a crowd whose pockets are unguarded. There were children in the crowd, small figures wedged between adult bodies, watching the roof above the prison gate with wide eyes. Herman Melville was also there. The American author had paid £half for a position on a rooftop. He watched and wrote in his diary afterwards the simple observation that a man and his wife had been hanged side by side, still unreconciled to each other, and that this was a remarkable change from the time they had stood together to be married. It is one of the few accounts of that morning that contains something approaching a human response to what was happening, rather than simply recording the spectacle. Inside the prison, the preparations were complete. Maria and Frederick Manning were brought separately to the prison chapel in the early morning for the final religious observance that Victorian custom demanded of the condemned. They received the sacrament from the prison chaplain. They sat in the chapel's cold wooden pews, and the chaplain read the words that the occasion required, and the candles burned on the altar, and the morning light came through the narrow windows and fell on the stone floor in thin, cold bands. Then they were brought together for the walk to the roof. Their arms were bound by the prison officers. This was standard practice, the pinioning of the arms before a public execution to prevent the condemned from attempting any final resistance or dramatic gesture that might interfere with the proceedings. Maria's arms were bound at her sides. Frederick's were bound likewise. They stood together, the two of them, in the corridor of Horsemonger Lane Gaol on the morning of the 13th of November 1849, for the first time in close proximity since the night of the 9th of August. They did not speak warmly to each other. They had, in the preceding days, arrived at something approaching reconciliation, the letters between them in the final weeks having shed the cold hostility of the first weeks of imprisonment, and moved towards something more like the exhausted recognition of two people who had run out of energy for enmity. But this was not the warmth of a restored marriage. It was the proximity of two people who had done what they had done together and were now going to face what came next in the same way. The prison bell began to toll. It tolled with the slow, measured rhythm that announced an execution, the sound carrying out from the prison across the streets of Walworth and into the packed crowd below. Each stroke of the bell moving through the cold air with a clarity that silenced the nearest parts of the crowd and produced a ripple of quiet that spread outward from the prison walls, like a wave moving across still water. Maria Manning and Frederick Manning walked with the prison officers and the chaplain through the final corridor and up the stairs that led to the roof above the main gate. The stairs were stone and narrow and cold. The sounds of the crowd filtered down through the walls of the prison as they climbed. At the top of the stairs, a door opened onto the flat roof where the gallows had been built, and the cold November air met them, and the light of the morning was grey and flat and without warmth. They stepped onto the roof. The sound of the crowd below rose immediately at the sight of them. 30,000 people producing sound in the same moment is a physical experience as much as an auditory one. It is felt in the chest before it is heard by the ear. It pressed up from the street below, and met the cold air of the roof, and the two condemned people, and the prison officers, and the chaplain, and William Calcraft. Calcraft worked quickly and without ceremony. This was what he did, and he did it without elaboration. He positioned Frederick at his place on the platform. He positioned Maria at hers. He adjusted the rope at each neck with the attention of a craftsman who understands that the details of this particular work matter in ways that are beyond aesthetics. He stepped back. Maria Manning stood on the gallows of Horsemonger Lane Gaol on the morning of the 13th of November in a dress of black satin. She had chosen it deliberately. This was her final decision, the last act of the woman who had dressed wealthy ladies in fine fabric and had understood, since the first days of her life in service, that what a person wears is what they say about themselves when words are no longer sufficient. Black satin was expensive. Black satin was elegant. Black satin was what a woman of quality wore on a formal occasion. Maria Manning wore it on the gallows as she might have worn it to a dinner at a great house, as a statement of the self she had always believed herself to be, and had never quite managed to become. The crowd below noted the dress, and would talk about it for years. Victorian women who had owned black satin reportedly gave it away in the months that followed, unwilling to wear a fabric associated with the execution. Whether this is fully accurate is something historians have disputed. What is not disputed is that the dress was noticed and remembered, which was precisely what Maria had intended. Calcraft withdrew the bolt. The drop fell. The sentence of the law was fulfilled, as the newspaper accounts would say the following morning, in the particular formal passive voice that Victorian journalism reserved for the moment of death at a public hanging, as though the agency in the matter belonged to no one and to nothing except the abstract machinery of justice. Frederick Manning died almost without struggle. The accounts of those watching agree on this. Whatever else Frederick Manning had been, whatever his failures and his cruelties and his small vanities and his large betrayals, he died quickly. Maria writhed for several seconds. Then the roof was still. The crowd below Horsemonger Lane Gaol made its sound for another moment, and then, in the way of crowds that have witnessed what they came to witness, it began to disperse. The people moved outward from the prison walls through the cold November morning with the slow, dissatisfied energy of an audience leaving a theatre. The pickpockets continued their work in the dissolving edges of the crowd. The clay pipes were relit. The bottles were emptied. The police lines relaxed their pressure as the density reduced. The street gradually revealed itself again. The cobblestones and the gutters and the ordinary morning traffic of Walworth, which had been suspended for the duration and now resumed. Charles Dickens went home and sat down and wrote a letter to the Times. He wrote it on the same day, in the immediate heat of what he had witnessed, and his letter was published the following morning. He described what he had seen in the crowd below the gallows as something that no heath and land under the sun could have produced. He described a wickedness and a levity that he could not reconcile with any honest purpose that public execution was supposed to serve. He was not alone in this response. The Manning execution became, in the months and years that followed, one of the turning points in the long argument about public hanging that would eventually end with the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, which moved executions inside the prison walls and away from the public gaze entirely. The argument had many participants and many stages and many contributing events, but the morning of the 13th of November 1849 on the roof of Horsemonger Lane Gaol was among its most cited. The bodies of Maria Manning and Frederick Manning were taken down after the customary hour and buried in the precincts of the prison. They were buried without ceremony and without the churchyard burial that most Victorian Protestants would have expected as the minimum of Christian recognition. The law of the time provided for the burial of executed murderers within the prison walls. They lay there, the two of them, in the ground of Horsemonger Lane Gaol as it stood above them through the decades that followed, until the prison was demolished in 1881 and the grave markers were rescued and preserved. Small relics of a case that Victorian London had been unable to stop talking about. A death mask of Maria Manning was taken after the execution. The mask was acquired by a physician in Dumfries named Thomas Grierson and passed eventually, along with the rest of his collection, to the Dumfries Museum in 1965, where it remains. It is the closest thing to Maria Manning's face that any observer now can see. The plaster holds the features of a woman in her late 20s. It holds the high cheekbones and the set jaw, and the composed, contained expression of a woman who has given nothing away. Even in death, she kept her countenance. Patrick O'Connor was buried quietly, as men without families to advocate loudly for them are often buried. His railway shares and his bonds and his gold and his watches had been recovered and inventoried and passed into the machinery of the legal process, and would eventually be disposed of according to the arrangements that the courts made for the estates of murder victims. His careful notebook was gone. His lodgings at Greenwood Street were taken by someone else. His post at the customs house was filled. The ordinary world closed over the space he had occupied with the efficiency it always shows in filling the gaps left by the dead. The broadsides sold their millions. The street literature sellers of Victorian London moved through the crowds in the days before and after the execution carrying their printed sheets, the crude woodcut portraits of Maria and Frederick Manning staring out from the paper with the simplified, flattened expressions that Victorian broadside illustration produced, and the text below them telling the story in the breathless, moralistic language of the form. 2.5 million copies of the various Manning broadsides were sold in the weeks surrounding the case. This was a number that exceeded the total circulation of the Illustrated London News for an entire year, multiplied 30-fold. The Manning case was the most consumed news story in England in 1849. Charles Dickens went on writing. In 1852, 3 years after the execution at Horsemonger Lane, he published the novel he had been composing in the period following that November morning. He called it Bleak House. In it, there is a character named Mademoiselle Hortense, a French-born lady's maid employed in a great English household. A woman of composure and intelligence and controlled ferocity, who commits murder and meets her end without flinching. Dickens never confirmed the connection directly. He did not need to. Every reader of 1852 who'd been alive in 1849 understood who Hortense was. The character was Maria Manning wearing a different name, moving through a different story but carrying in her bearing and her actions and her final defiant composure the unmistakable quality of the woman who had stood on the roof of Horsemonger Lane in a dress of black satin. The house at number 3 Miniver Place stood for some years after the execution, and was eventually demolished along with the rest of the terrace, absorbed into the expanding fabric of South London as the city continued its endless process of building over itself. The street where it stood still exists, changed beyond recognition, carrying no visible memory of the house or the kitchen or the flagstone floor, or the grave that Maria Manning dug beneath it in the August heat of 1849. The leather market that stood across from the house, against which Maria had measured the ordinariness of her days in Bermondsey, survived longer. Its brick front faced the street that had faced the Manning house and looked at an absence where the terrace had been. The lime that Maria had poured into the earth for her kitchen was gone long before the house came down. It had done its work and been exhausted and dispersed into the soil of the Thames River basin and the city above it, which holds the chemical memory of everything that has ever been buried in it and keeps it without comment. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark.